Okay, we'll give it another minute or so before we begin. Right then, it's 6:30 according to my watch, so we'll begin. Good evening and welcome, or perhaps I should say welcome back. It doesn't seem that long ago since we were all last here. I'm Councillor Andy Konietzko, the Acting Chair of the Economic Planning and Housing Committee, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting, which is being held virtually and in accordance with the Council's rules for virtual meetings, which reflect the recently published government regulations. The meeting is being streamed live on YouTube and will also be available to view after the meeting has finished. Councillors who sit on this committee are identified by name on the screen, and I'll introduce the officers by name before they address the committee. Councillors are reminded that although this meeting is being held remotely, they are regarded as being present in a meeting of the council, and they should observe the normal rules of behaviour under the Member Code of Conduct and not allow members of their household to distract them during the course of the meeting. Can members ensure that their mobile phones are now switched off or are on silent, please? Members of the committee will turn on their video link during the meeting and keep their microphones muted unless they have been invited to speak by myself as the chair. Members are reminded that if they switch off their video link or move away from the camera, they will be treated as leaving the meeting and will not be able to take part in any vote taken on the item under discussion. Members can indicate their wish to speak by raising their hand, ideally electronically please, and should only speak when I, as the chair, invite them to do so. The officers present will only switch on their video link during the item that they're presenting or where they wish to be invited to speak by me as chair. Councillors should declare that they are leaving the meeting and switch off their video link if they have a disclosable pecuniary interest or other personal interest in an item on the agenda. The councillors can switch on their video link when I call the next agenda item. Hopefully we won't have any IT problems. We don't normally, but this is the first time I've ever chaired a meeting, so it's more than likely that we're going to get a whole year's worth of IT issues this evening. If that happens, can I remind councillors that if their connection is lost, they should immediately advise the Democratic Support Officer and use their meeting link to access the meeting again. Like last week, I'm going to pause the meeting at 8 o'clock so that those of us who want to can take part in the clap for carers. So that's the introduction. So welcome everyone. So we'll go through the agenda now, starting with item number 1, apologies for absence and substitutions. As you might have gathered, Councillor Frost isn't here, he's off sick. That's the only apology I have at the moment. Does anyone else have any other apologies or any substitutions? No, nothing. That's good. Okay, declarations of interest, item number 2. Any declarations of interest? Yes, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Andy. So I was looking for the raised hand then. Were any of the papers discuss anything to do with nitrates? I just want to put on record, I have historically worked on the issue in other parts of Hampshire.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else? Councillor Watts, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you, Chair. Page 88, 89, it discusses Basingstoke Sports and Social Club, i.e. which is Basingstoke Cricket Club, and I was on the committee and was captain at the time when the application was made, so it's just an interest there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Councillor Aldridge.
Just to let members know that I work for Sovereign Housing Association. I don't think it's going to particularly come up other than Sovereign responsible for some of the affordable housing that's been built, but just really sort of agenda item 6, the monitoring report, it may indirectly come up. So just to make members aware that I do work for Sovereign if it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to item number 3, urgent matters. I'm not aware of any urgent matters. Sadie, is there anything that's come in the past few minutes that we ought to be aware of?
No, nothing.
Lovely. Okay, so item number 4 is minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of January. As it was just a week ago, those minutes haven't yet been circulated, so we will review and approve those at the next EPH meeting on the 4th of March. Which brings us on to agenda item 5 already. This is going to be presented by Mark Lambert. Before I hand over to Mark and also to Councillor Raffel, who's going to be introducing the paper, want to make you aware that this paper, the infrastructure funding statement, has already been published and is online on our website and has been since the end of last year. So the purpose for having it on our agenda this evening is twofold. One is for us as the EPH committee to note the document, and secondly, it's also to provide all of us with an opportunity to quiz the authors of it and ask any questions that we may have. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Councillor Raffel to please introduce the paper.
Chairman, thank you. And you are absolutely right. And you have effectively introduced the paper yourself. It is a statutory requirement. It's a new statutory requirement. And the purpose of bringing matters to committee is that it brings members up to speed with where we are. And please don't criticise the authors. They are doing their best as officers to fulfil the criteria that are set out for them. There may well be need to criticise the progress, but fair comment will be made and the points noted on that. So I look forward to hearing what you've got to say on the paper.
Thank you, Councillor Raffel. I'll hand over to Mark Lambert to now present the paper. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. As has been highlighted, this is just a short paper to introduce the infrastructure funding statement to you. And as noted, it is a statutory requirement that we now prepare these once a year and that we publish those on the website by the 31st of December each year, which is in line with the approach for the authority monitoring report, which is next on your agenda this evening. Things to highlight to you is that effectively this is outlining what still has been received and Section 106 during the last financial year, say for 2019-2020, and to also outline how we intend to spend still in the future. Of relevance in this respect is the infrastructure list, which forms a part of the infrastructure funding statement and is within the papers. To draw to your attention that this was adopted by Cabinet in December, and that this is the same as the previous Regulation 123 list that the Council adopted back in summer of 2018 when SIL was introduced. At its time of preparation, it was important to ensure that the items listed there clearly outlined where SIL will be sought and used as opposed to Section 106. So, for example, you'll note there that there are various transport and sport schemes listed for SIL, and these were set out in that way purely because it was envisaged that Section 106 wouldn't be an effective funding mechanism. It's proposed that we undertake a light touch review of the list later in the year to consider the scope for minor amendments as required. And obviously looking ahead as we undertake the local plan updates, we will be reviewing the SIL rates and the list that goes with that. So there will be opportunity to explore that in more detail in the future. I should highlight to councillors that there is a minor consistency issue between the SIL report that I'm presenting this evening and the authority monitoring report in respect of a figure relating to the SIL liability notices issued. And that's been corrected in the version of the AMR on the website. Chair, the recommendation, as you've highlighted, is to note the IFS and the requirement to prepare one of these annually in the future.
Right, thank you very much, Mark. Okay, as has been highlighted by both the speakers so far, this is quite a short paper, so I propose that we go through it page by page. It starts on page 10 of the agenda pack, but page 10, page 11 and page 12 are primarily definitions. So if we begin with the table on page 13, if you would like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll attempt to invite you to speak in the order in which I see the hands raised. So I can see Councillor Cubitt, you're there first, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the report, Mark. And I understand absolutely what this report tries to achieve going forwards. But I raise the matter, as I have raised on a number of occasions, with regards to the infrastructure deficit that was identified back in 2015, where it was identified that Basingstoke and Deane had an infrastructure requirement of about 250 million, of which there was a deficit identified of 197 million. And whilst I think it's highly commendable that we're looking at raising money through SIL to meet future infrastructure requirements, those sums are not significant in that there's an enormous difference between 197 million and the monies that we're talking about tonight. And I'm just wondering whether we know that the gap between the SIL that's being discussed going forward and the gap that was identified in 2015 has been met. Thank you.
Mark, do you want to go first on that one?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Yes, that was the figure that was referred to some time ago. And really, just to give a bit of background to that, the purpose of identifying that gap was to meet one of the tests that the SIL examiner required of us in order to justify the introduction of SIL. Clearly, we had to show that there's a gap, otherwise we wouldn't be permitted to introduce the funding regime that we did. So it performed that function at the time and met that requirement. The infrastructure funding gap is a snapshot at a moment in time, and that was undertaken a couple of years back when we were preparing the local plan. Clearly, since that time, a number of infrastructure projects have been completed, a number of sites have come forward which have provided their own infrastructure through Section 106 funding and through on-site provision. And so it's quite a difficult measure to draw a firm conclusion on that funding gap at this moment in time, given all the things that have changed over the course of that period. Clearly, SIL will only ever make up a relatively small proportion of the funding gap, because we would expect developers to be providing facilities and services on site. Other provision is made through the utility companies and funding regimes such as Ofwat, and we're reliant on the LEP and other external funding sources to close that gap. So I think it's a difficult one to pin down at this moment in time, but to offer some reassurance that the gap has been closed and the sites are delivered, more infrastructure kit is provided on the ground.
Councillor Cubitt, does that answer your question? I think you might be on mute there, Councillor Cubitt.
Sorry, I said thank you very much.
Oh, lovely, great stuff. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the response. Councillor Watts is next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mark, for the report. On the table there, it states that we've got a swimming strategy and we've got 650 odd £1,000 in that strategy. How easy is it to start these?
Sorry, Councillor Watts, we're looking at the table on page 13 at the moment.
Right. Sorry.
That's all right. We'll come back to that later. If you can hold that for us, that would be
all
brilliant.
Right. Sorry, thank you.
Councillor Harvey.
No, thank you, Chair. And just picking up on Mark's answer to Councillor Cubitt, really. I mean, if we identified historically that the funding regime that we were designing in SIL was never going to be enough to actually deliver the infrastructure required, and thus we're seeing developers through SIL, their obligation to meet their requirements for the sites they're bringing forward, are we saying that on top of SIL, we're expecting Section 106 to pick up the same sort of infrastructure that SIL would have funded? Because as I understood it, Section 106 under the SIL regime is very specific, and that was the reason for introducing SIL in the first place. So I don't think Section 106 should be filling the SIL gap, because in essence, we're talking about two different things. If the funding regime is as it was described to us when we adopted our local plan, and as you rightly say, it went before the inspector as such. So in a sense, we're talking about two different things, as I understood it. But if we're now saying that because of the funding gap, we're reliant on Section 106 to fill that hole in part, that's quite a different conversation we're having. Circumstance might have taken us there, Mark, but I'm just conscious that's quite a different thing to where we were on the local plan. And if you're saying that the developers have to provide it on site, then I'll come on to that later, Chair, another question on another page. Well, that presents an issue, does it not, with the sheer amount of off-site contributions that are being proposed by developers as a result of their inability to deliver the infrastructure required on the sites they're promoting. There's a real conundrum there. I'm not sure how you answer it. I know this report is only a snapshot, but I'm not sure how we answer that infrastructure question. Or is that just something that's going to leave wide open for as long as we ever have a future local plan? Are we ever going to be able to answer that question?
Shall I come back, Chair? I think you're right in saying that they are two different funding regimes. Section 106 is very site specific and is there to mitigate the impacts of that development. So it will be through a combination of on-site facilities and off-site mitigation that's required to address the impacts of that. So, for example, on the road network. The funding gap exists, and it's something that we are aware of, having done the work on the IDP to come up with that figure that Councillor Cubitt referred to. And I think it's fair to say that that funding gap includes items which will be funded by SIL, funded through Section 106, and funded through other mechanisms. And if you look back on the IDP, you'll see that it has a table which clearly has a tick in the box which says 106 or SIL or some other funding mechanism. So I think there's an acknowledgement that the funding gap is closed and shrunk through various funding sources. I think quite an important one to consider in this conversation is the capital programmes of the Borough Council and Hampshire County Council in that respect, as well as the funding we've benefited from the LEP in terms of the improvement to the A33, for example. So I think we do have a reliance on looking externally for funding, but an awareness that developers and development will provide a fair chunk of that as well to support their impacts.
Thank you, Mark. Does that answer the question, Councillor Harvey? As best it can. Yes, good. Thumbs up. Lovely. Councillor Laura James, please.
Thank you. Picking up on the sort of the 2 points, I suppose, all the points have been raised in relation to the risk management. It talks about no significant risk. I'd like to sort of explore that really, that you don't think there's any significant risk, but also I think maybe in the future this is going to be an annual report that comes forward. Is it something that we maybe should look at how we present risk in relation to this paper, in relation to the colouring of it, or to give us some indication of the risks that were involved in relation to each area that we're talking about within this report? I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor James. Mark?
We have carried out a risk assessment to accompany the report. That's based upon the IFS itself. Clearly, the report and the content of it and the infrastructure provision is reliant on other mechanisms. So the delivery of sites, the associated 106 agreements, and ultimately the delivery of infrastructure. So I think it's how far you take that risk assessment, which is at this stage has been based solely upon the IFS and its preparation. So I think there's various dependencies there, and how far you wish to take that. But certainly a risk assessment has been undertaken at this stage and didn't flag up any specific issues. Obviously, I think in terms of developments and bringing forward homes and other forms of development, there's generally a Section 106 agreement to ensure that mitigation is provided and what's required happens on the ground.
Thank you, Mark. If there's interest, is there a possibility of potentially circulating that risk assessment to members of the committee? Would people be, yes, a few thumbs up and a few nodding heads? Would that be possible, Mark?
Yes, that's fine. Yes, leave that with me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Councillor James, is that okay for you? Good stuff. And we have one more question on this page, and that's from Councillor Cubitt. Yes,
sorry. I'm just thinking about the really valid comments that have just been made by Councillor James in particular, and Councillor Harvey. And I'm thinking about the tariffs that we're going to be discussing in the next paper with regards to zoning and CLI payments. And I'm thinking about the fact that this is going to be an annual report. And I'm thinking that actually it would be jolly useful for us as members to see the broader picture. And by that I mean that we've already awarded many down a zero sill tariff. And we've already awarded Hounsome Fields a zero tariff. And we've awarded Basingstoke Golf Course, east of Basingstoke and Upper Cufford a lower tariff. And the rationale behind those lower tariffs is because those sites are supposed to be providing us equivalent on site of what they would have to pay were they to pay sill, and that therefore from a viability perspective they've been issued with this either zero tariff or lesser tariff. And I'm thinking that we should have two balance sheets. We should have the sill payment balance sheet, and we should also have a balance sheet which is in effect the monies that the developers have paid, but that they haven't paid through sill, because their argument is that they're providing it and that it wouldn't be able to be delivered in addition to sill because of their viability narrative, i.e. we really understand what the developer is providing us on site, which has resulted in them not paying sill. And I think if that were on a sheet in one place for us as members, then we could truly understand the infrastructure that's being paid for by these developers who've been given a kind of a pink ticket or a green ticket, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what other members think about that.
Anyone else want to put their hand up if they have a strong view? Councillor Harvey is a thumbs up. Did you want to speak, Councillor Harvey?
Well, just to say, I agree. I think if we're going to have the whole picture, let's have the whole picture. And I think the way that's presented in the way that Councillor Cubitt describes would be incredibly useful. So yes, if there's a recommendation going from the committee to officers for a future presentation in that regard, I would very much support it.
Thank you, Councillor. I see a few more nodding heads from some of the other councillors. So Mark, is that something we can look into doing?
Yeah, and if I can perhaps offer a couple of bits of information that might be useful, Chair. I suppose looking back, when we undertook the viability assessment with our consultants a couple of years back, they were given a range of assumptions to model, as it were, for each of the key sites. So we would have factored into that equation things such as the cost of the school provision or things such as the cost of the community centre. So they had all the ingredients that we would have required of a site, and they would have factored that into their modelling, such that when they were cranking the handle on the calculation and coming out the other end was a sill rate, they should broadly be in balance with one another. So we have that piece of information, which is the viability study that's on the website, which I can circulate details of. I suppose alongside that and looking back on what's happened with the planning application, we have each of the Section 106 agreements, which says, for example, that when this permission is granted for, say, 1,000 houses, that provision will be made for a 2-form entry school. So we've got that check at the end of the process as well. So I think I can offer some comfort that work has already been undertaken to some extent. I'm happy to pull together a short briefing note to help members' understanding if that's helpful. And clearly, when we move to the next local plan update and undertake a review of SIL going forwards, we'll undertake this exercise again to make sure that the sites that we're proposing to allocate have the necessary ingredients in terms of community centres, schools and the like.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, if I could just, as a follow-up, I wouldn't want to be asking for masses of extra work, officers, please understand that. All I'm saying is that in one place, it would be, you know, because it would be a very fair balance sheet, because if the developer's maintaining that it's paying, then it's paying, whether it's in the SIL column or actually in a hard expenditure towards the school or the roundabout. That should just be on a balance sheet, either SIL, Section 2106, or physical payment for roundabout and or school, or both. Okay, thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Yeah, that's noted. Did that come across loud and clear, Mark?
It did, yes. There's a few things to ponder, but leave that with me.
Thank you very much. That'd be brilliant if you can look into that for us. Councillor Vokes, sorry if I pronounce your name correctly. It's so ironic that somebody with my surname has to ask how to pronounce somebody else's. But
no, that's fine. Thanks very much. I've got just a tiny question, showing my ignorance here. In 1A, it talks about surcharges, £10,593. What does that relate to?
Mark?
Thank you. That relates to where we the SIL regulations are very prescriptive on what has to be undertaken and which forms have to be completed at which stage when an applicant is submitting all the various forms that they need to accompany SIL information these days, and that's a government requirement. And so if there are mistakes in that, such as a developer fails to tell us when they've commenced development in terms of SIL, which they're obliged to do so, then the government regulations require that we add a surcharge onto their SIL payment. And that's a national kind of requirement in that sense. So the figure there that you see of around £10,500 reflects those surcharges that we've imposed because of a failure by the applicants at various stages. Just to put that into perspective, we do offer a lot of hand-holding to applicants to make sure that they do follow the regulations, because we're aware that it is a new process. So we wouldn't want to be surcharging somebody unnecessarily, but yeah, there are a few instances where that's not been the case.
And is that money that is retained by the council, or does it go somewhere else?
It's retained by the council in that sense and is used to fund infrastructure.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you both. Okay, Councillor George.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just interested in the comments made, particularly by Councillor Cubitt, regarding the funding structure for SIL and things like that. Given the issues fundamentally around Many Down and as mentioned, the golf course all getting preferred rates, first the question I got is given that those sites are clearly allocated or have been allocated through the local plan and there's the opportunity to negotiate those rates, how does this fit in now in future with the neighbourhood planning regime? Are we as a neighbourhood plan able to sit down with these guys and say, actually, you know, if we allocate a site here, we can come up with a special rate through SIL for you, or if it's you know, can we do that, number one? Second, the question is really about looking at the rates and the way they're structured. There's a perception here, and particularly if you look at the infrastructure list, that is truly borough-wide and it's what have you. There must be a perception here that some of the rural areas now are going to end up paying additional SILs to fund, you know, there's a bit of a taxation on these people to fund some borough-wide schemes, and that's the way it's going to go in future because it's going to be available right across the borough. So I'd just like your comments on those, please.
Thank you, Councillor George. Mark, a couple of questions there for you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just in terms of the differentials in rates there, they're not negotiated rates as such, but they've very much been set by the viability assessment. So they're based upon what can be afforded in terms of a development without impacting on its viability and its ability to be delivered. So there's only so much that you're able to extract from a particular development before it becomes unviable. And so sitting behind all the SIL rates is a detailed viability assessment that's been tested at examination to make sure they're set at the appropriate level without stymieing the ability to deliver homes in the borough. So they're very much set on a scientific basis in that respect. So the ability for a neighbourhood plan group or a parish or town council to negotiate isn't there, I'm afraid. In terms of the other point you made around the rural areas being used to fund infrastructure across the borough, you'll see that the infrastructure list includes a wide variety of things. These have been included where it's believed there won't be a significant amount of development, and therefore the ability to secure these through Section 106 and through development itself is very much limited. They've been drawn up. This was drawn up several years ago now, but on the back of evidence that we have, such as the leisure and recreational needs assessment, and on the basis of officers' advice elsewhere with the council and others and within other service providers.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor George, does that answer your questions?
Can I just clarify that very quickly, if I may? Thank you for the answers, very, very good. Does that mean fundamentally SIL is going to be set at a very much an individual planning application level in the future? In other words, if something comes forward, are we going to sit down at that point and say, well, this is the SIL that's going to be paid, which is what you seem to be suggesting, looking at the viability of those schemes. So is it going to be open fundamentally in the future for a scheme to come forward and we turn around and instead of going to the tables about £200 per square metre for this areas, that these people can come in and say, we can't do this, it's not viable, therefore we want to reduce SIL. Is that the way it's going to operate?
No, the SIL rates are established and they're set now for all forms of development where there's a SIL charge that's liable. They're non-negotiable. So if you wish to develop the homes in a particular area, then you are required to pay that SIL rate that's set out in the SIL charging schedule. What is a little bit more negotiable is the Section 106 agreement that's associated with that, where the policies in the local plan allow for negotiation on the basis, well, not negotiation, on the basis of financial viability.
Thank you both. Right, no more hands raised on page 13. So let's move on to pages 14 and 15. Any questions on those table entries there? Nothing. No. Good. Okay, so let's move on to page 16. 3A to 3F. No. Let's move on to page 17 in that case. And Councillor Watts, this is where swimming comes in. So do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we got money set aside for swimming strategy. I just wonder how easy it is to change the scope of this SIL, where it's actually going to be spent. Would we have to advertise it again if we say we wanted an ice skating strategy or something, money to go towards an ice rink, or how do we go about that? And we've got lots of money allocated in these particular areas for community facilities. Does that money have to be spent in those particular areas? You know, I just wonder how broad that scope is. I wonder if you could just answer those. Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the table on page under 3G, which is on page 13 of 17, is looking at planning obligations. So that's Section 106 agreements. The money's secured in that respect. Each planning obligation and Section 106 is very specific to the site and to the main mitigation. So there's relatively little flex in how that money can be spent. So, for example, if the Section 106 names a particular community centre, then that is where that money must be spent in that respect. Councillor Watts mentioned what I think was the infrastructure list, which is on subsequent pages, and whether there's scope to change that. Chair, if you're happy, I'm happy to kind of pick up that point now, but it does crop up a little later.
Yeah, if we move on to that one, I'm conscious I've already deferred one of Councillor Watts's questions, but yeah, if we pick up that one when we get to it, we're not that far away now. So yeah, if we do that, that'd be great. Councillor Watts, if you can just hold off there. But did that answer the first part of your question?
How do we change? Sorry, yeah. How do we change the 106 of what we want money spent on? I mean, we've got swimming strategy. Why not an ice rink strategy?
To say that particular table is around 106 agreement. So
yeah, how can we change that? Is that easy to change?
You're unable to change the existing 106s because they've been signed or a signed legal agreement between us and the developers or the landowners. But I think the point you're making is around how we may change the infrastructure list on subsequent pages.
Yeah,
so SIL can fund those. So that's the point I think.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. We'll come back to that one, Councillor Watts. Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Same table, looking specifically at open space as an example. And this really is for Mark looking forward to the policy implications of Section 106. If we are taking money from developers for the provision of open space or whatever else we might take it for, and their planning obligations, and the developer is seeking to mitigate their development, I'm going to offer you X £1,000 for the fact that I'm not going to provide an open space element on my site. And then we're into a position where a developer, because our policy is such, is allowed to do that, but as a community, we have to suffer the disbenefit because we get a development that isn't consuming its own smoke. Similarly, you can only improve a piece of open space that currently exists so far. You can't magic it out of thin air. And in that sense, we're still taking money for Section 106 improvements from developers for things we can no longer improve logistically in that particular area. And I think there's a policy element to this that we need to look at in the new local plan review, whereby we make developers give the infrastructure we need on site, and they can't just mitigate it and get out of it. And similarly so, the money we take is genuinely used to improve the local infrastructure that's required in an area. And there's a real balance there. And I just think at the moment we haven't got it, because I'm seeing too many applications come forward where the developer is mitigating and getting out of providing it. And then the pressure is on the community to have to suffer that disbenefit because there's nothing we can do about it in the current format. So if you could think about that in terms of the new local plan and how we might adjust policy to capture that point, I think that would be very, very helpful. At least I don't know what other members feel in terms of their own experiences of planning applications in their own ward.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Actually, on that point, does anyone want to speak? And Councillor James, I see you put your hand up. Is that in relation, Councillor Laura James? Is that in relation to Paul Harvey's point? Yeah. In that case, please feel free to chip in there.
I suppose it's not in relation. It's more in relation to Gary's point.
Oh, well, we'll come back to you in that case. I just want to see if there's anyone who sort of specifically wants to back up anything that Councillor Harvey's just said. Councillor Miller, you put your hand up. Is that in relation to what? Yeah. Okay. Over to you then. Oh, you're on mute, Councillor Miller. Still on mute.
I've been on Teams too long. Just chase the screen. Yes, I can relate directly in my ward what Councillor Harvey is talking about. The way a developer got out of it, and the site is the Razors Farm. The developer went to appeal before we had a chance to determine it in the borough. The story is, the reason why is immaterial right now. Went to appeal, and directly with open spaces, and we need to be a little careful about what the inspector did. The open space requirement to Razors Farm, I hope all councillors know where it is, was Downgrange. That was the identified open space for Razors Farm. You can't get more ridiculous than that. It's an existing open space. We couldn't improve it. Downgrange is a magnificent facility for this borough, but we were absolutely screwed. Now, that would have overridden any policy because it's coming from the examiner, it's coming from PINS. So we have to be very careful, and I do support that we've got to have some policy in here that really does ensure that the developer provides the open space. But I've got a nasty feeling all the developers know what happened over Razors Farm, and I think we need to be very, very careful. But I support everything that Councillor Harvey said.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. Mark, do you want to respond to that?
It's probably best that I don't go into site-specific and details of particular planning applications because I don't know have the history before me, but I think that the point is noted generally on the provision of open space in the vicinity and the ability to mitigate the impacts of that locally. I think that's one that we can take away, and I know I'm aware that Ruth and Joe are on the call from the planning team as well. So between us, we'll note that.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Councillor Gavin James, your hand was up next.
Yes, good evening, Chair. Similar point, this time on affordable housing, similar situation. A lot of developers say, oh, we'll develop it off-site, and then we end up with this pot of money for affordable housing somewhere, which ends up being nowhere. And I think we've recently had experience where if you get that money, you have to spend it on a certain thing within a certain amount of time. And if you can't find a location within that time, technically you just return the money, or it dies, or it disappears. I'm not quite sure what happens to it, but you are under time pressure to use that money, so it's not always ideal. So what I was interested in knowing is, this is obviously the first time we've done this. When we see next year's, will it have comparisons in terms of the outstanding monies, the monies that have been allocated but not spent, so that we can see whether or not there is a bubble growing within the system in terms of lots of money being assembled for affordable homes, or the money for swimming has now got to a critical mass where it could do something, because it'd be good to see where this is going. Because at the moment we talk a lot about having a shortage of money for infrastructure, but this document's got an awful lot of money that hasn't yet been spent on infrastructure. Now obviously there's always a delay, but how long is that delay, and are we getting through this money and spending it? And if not, why not? Will be part of an annual review. So just we have sort of this year, next year, like you'd normally see in a sort of budget, in terms of how we're doing with this money.
Thank you, Councillor James. Mark?
The IFS and that particular table is for that previous financial year, but obviously when we come back to members, we can highlight previous years, so we start to build up a picture. It's probably worth highlighting that this table refers to money allocated. So it's money where a scheme has been developed and we may be looking to progress that within the next 3 years within the budgets we have available. So I wouldn't want members to think that the money was sitting there and wasn't being spent. Obviously, schemes are being worked up to ensure it's spent in the most effective way to mitigate those impacts. It may be that the detailed design of a particular piece of infrastructure is being worked on at present, or consultation undertaken with the local community.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Laura James, I think you said your point was in relation to something that Councillor Watts has said. I think we're going to go back to Councillor Watts's question. So are you happy to wait until we've addressed that?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. So let's quickly move on to page 18 in that case. So sections 3H3 all the way down to 4B. Anyone want to say anything in relation to that? No. In that case, let's move on to the infrastructure list on page 19. So Councillor Watts. I think this is the response that Mark was going to give was in relation to this table. So if I invite Mark first to give the response, and Councillor Watts, if there's anything else that you want to follow up, you can go straight away afterwards.
Thank you, Chair. This is just as a quick reminder, this was whether we are able to amend the list and to reference the ice rink as part of that. There is scope to amend the list, but I think the scope is reasonably limited, because if it has an implication for viability, then that does have impacts on development generally. We are able to add things to the list potentially, and I think what we are looking to do is later in the year to bring back to members an updated list for consideration, at which point we will be obliged to consult more widely with stakeholders than like before we can re-adopt that. But that is something that we have on the work programme, not formally perhaps, but it is certainly something that officers are minded to do.
Councillor Watts, do you have a supplementary to that?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Obviously, we'd like members to feed into that, because there's as previous speakers have said, there's been an awful lot of money unallocated here, and there's a lot of general need within the borough, and we have a leisure park which is in need of a desperate revamp, and I think 106 money or seal money could be used in that particular area. Thank you.
Mark, is there a mechanism for ward members to make those suggestions?
I think what we would like to do at the right time, Chair, is to bring back a report to the committee with recommendations on how the list could be amended. Clearly, we're not able to change existing 106 agreements to fund alternative infrastructure, but there's a little bit more flex in terms of SIL there, where there aren't viability issues. So that's something that officers will give some consideration to.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Laura James, you had a related question, so I will invite you to speak next, please. You're on mute at the moment. Oh, you're still on mute. Right, we've got you now.
You got me now?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. Well, mine was really, there's a couple of points, but it was about when Gary was asking about the 106 and whether you were able to change it. I know that you said you can't, but if the developer was in agreement, I know that's an illegal agreement and it went through a planning process, but if the developer was in agreement that there could be changes, why couldn't we do that? I know legal get very nervous about this. We've sort of had these discussions in our own ward, but why couldn't we make some changes to that 106 agreement if things have changed along the way? And the other point I raise is in relation to what Gavin was saying about 106 and it being identified for an area. So he had money identified for older persons accommodation, and there was a timescale for it. And what happened, it didn't get met within that time, so it went back into a pot for general needs. And what I think we should be aware of as members is how that piece of work is going on, and are we meeting the requirement of the 106 agreement, or if there is a slippage or something happens and it didn't get met for that, because obviously members in DC would have required or that was the requirement. The 106 was for that purpose, and then it didn't happen. I think we need to in some way capture that as members and be able to monitor it and be aware of what's happening.
So a couple of questions there for you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking off the first one of Councillor James's questions around the scope to vary Section 106 agreements. There is that scope. However, we have to make sure that each of the obligations within the legal agreement meets the government's 3 tests for planning obligations. So it isn't kind of carte blanche to make significant changes, but where there is agreement and that obligation still mitigates the impact of the development and is linked to it and is appropriate in scale and size, then there is some limited opportunity in that respect. But that's very much case by case and site by site, and bearing in mind that those government regulations in respect of planning obligations. I wouldn't want to stray too much into detail on a particular planning obligation around the elder person's accommodation, because again, I don't have the detail of that before me. But obviously,
so my point wasn't really it is an example that where we identified a piece of work that was meant to be done in relation to 106 and it slips and it goes back into a general pot. Or how do we monitor that as members? How do we see performance? Because are we aware that we were identifying older persons accommodation for a development in New Road that never happened, and it then went back into the general needs pot for general needs housing? Where does that come up? I'd just like to understand that process, really.
that might be one that I have to take away with me, I'm afraid, and speak and liaise with colleagues. So perhaps that's an action I can take from the committee this evening.
Thanks, Mark. Councillor James, anything else? No, lovely. Okay, so Councillor George, you had your hand up next, and then Councillor Miller, I've noted you've got your hand up too.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at, I'm assuming that the table goes right the way through to page 21. So if that's all right, it does.
If we could just stick to page 19 just for the moment, Councillor George. If you've got anything on any subsequent pages, we'll come back to you, I promise.
Okay, then that's fine.
Okay, Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is the first time we've seen these documents, when they issued the agenda. I'm trying to get to grips with the columns. You've got an infrastructure to be wholly or partly funded from SIL recipients. So we've gone from SIL to 106 back to SIL again. And then we've got an exclusions column. I'm trying to rationalize what's in the left-hand column of infrastructure to be funded by SIL, and then the exclusions. There's no exclusions in the first list. And by the way, some of those entries in there are 25, 30 years old. And they are so ancient, they really need to be purged, I think. And these exclusions, so do I assume that the exclusions are not covered by SIL? I'm not sure. We haven't really been explained to what those exclusions compare to what's been entered into the other side of it. And on the other page, you've got reference to specifically one is Manydown, then you don't refer to Manydown again. You say the development. Are you being generalized or is it specific? And it's hard to determine what's going on here.
Mark, over to you.
The list is effectively, as you've described, the column on the left is for things that will be fully or partially funded by SIL, whereas those that are excluded in the right-hand column will be funded by Section 106. And it's in that way such that developers have clarity on what the expectations of them will be. What you'll tend to find is the items in the right-hand column that refer to the 106 pieces of infrastructure are the types of things you would expect to find on a large strategic site. So typically they are the community centres or the schools where the developer will be bringing those forward as part and parcel of the scheme. The items in the left-hand column tend to be those that are less specifically related to development, but are a known kind of infrastructure issue. But because development won't be coming forward in that vicinity, there's less scope for Section 106 to secure that piece of infrastructure. Therefore, we identify that SIL would be could be used to secure that.
Quick follow-up, Chair, please.
Please go for it.
May I suggest, just for a bit of clarity, for anybody who picks up this paper, you've made the explanation to this group of people here that under exclusions, just put in possibly funded by S106, and it just separates the two columns. First column is SIL, second one is S106. Just a little bit of clarity, and then anybody who examines this will be made aware of the difference. You're bringing the two together. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I can see Mark nodding at that, so that's agreed. Okay, so there's no other hands for page 19. So if we move on to the final two pages, pages 20 and 21, Councillor George, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Yes, look, I think the first question I was going to have was exactly what is included in the first column as infrastructure, and is this future projects or what have you? Because I think Councillor Miller's already mentioned that the fact that some of these, I'm looking at the artificial turf pitch at Testbourne Community School. Well, they've been playing on that for about 18 months now. So I'm just wondering what that column involved. Is that future looking? Is it past? And it's not very clear there, number one. And so, you know, I would have expected to come here a list of future projects, not old ones that have already been completed. And unless they're going to build another pitch at Testbourne School, which I'd certainly support, but I doubt whether they've got the money for that. The second question I've got is looking at the page 21, the last two on flooding and water. Now, I'm, should we say, slightly concerned here in terms of the scope of where money is going to be used here. Now, if you look projects to support meeting the aims of the Water Framework Directive, well, primarily that comes around about water infrastructure, treatment works, and all that sort of stuff. Are we going to be starting to use SIL money to actually implement changes that should be the responsibility of basically the water companies, or even if you're looking at flooding, that's clearly an EA responsibility. Are we going to be starting to basically put the responsibility of those infrastructure changes on developments?
Thank you, Councillor George. Mark?
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of the pitches point referred to in terms of Whitchurch, just to offer some comfort that we are aware that there are some items on the list that have now been provided and are there and being used. And I think when we undertake the review of the list later on in the year, we'll look to remove those items such that it presents a more up-to-date picture. We had to adopt the list via Cabinet just before Christmas to meet the government requirements. So we didn't have the opportunity to go through that in the detail that we wished to at that stage. Just picking up on the number and variety of items listed there, it's probably worth being aware that there's no obligation for us to fund these pieces of infrastructure, and that the decision is within our gift as the charging authority to spend those as we wish. So purely because it's there doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that funding will be provided from us. And I think at the stage of drawing up the list a couple of years back, it was a formal request made of us by the Environment Agency that we made reference to this. So that's just a little bit of back history in that respect.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Miller, does that answer both of your questions?
Sorry, Councillor George, is it?
Oh, sorry, Councillor George. My apologies. Sorry.
It does, but it does indeed. But I'm just wondering to what extent this is a backdoor opening onto making funds available from developments to satisfy infrastructures of other organisations, such as the water companies. I'm just wondering, is there an indication that route may be used? Are we going to end up getting requests through SIL for improvements to water treatment work, for example?
Mark?
Just to put it into context, there are other items on the list, such as education, that aren't necessarily services provided by ourselves. So, we do have other external agencies that could be seeking SIL to support infrastructure improvements. And I suppose it's worth reinforcing that decisions on SIL spend rest with the Borough Council, and that's within our gift in that respect.
That's reassuring. Thank you.
Thank you both. Councillor Cubitt, you were next.
Yes, sorry. So in terms of this list, which you said earlier refers to the fact that you just segued the 1, 2, 3 list into this list, are we going to have a financial cost beside this, i.e. an estimate of, say, for example, the cost of an A33 link to Cufford Lane? And then next door to that, will we then have the money that we've allocated to this infrastructure list in future years? So will we see accumulation of funds that will be allocated to this?
Mark.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Cubitt. No, there's no current plan to present it in that way. We have got some costings set out in the last version of the IDP from a couple of years back that will give you that information, but there's no current requirement to present it in the IFS in that respect. We've simply followed the government regulations in preparing the documents as set out.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Just a follow up. I mean, I don't know what other members feel in this regard, but I have to say I thank you very much, Mark, for everything you've done, and I understand it's a new report, and I certainly wouldn't wish to be advocating extra work. But in terms of usefulness, in addition to the request that I made earlier, which I think would be incredibly useful, I don't know what other members think, but it would be, in my opinion, also useful when we have an ability to add to this list and don't have to respect the 1, 2, 3 list, which was a legacy list, and we then consider adding other matters that are not going to be financed directly by the developers. So, for example, in the case of the Many Down, one of the reasons why they got a SIL 0 tariff is because Hampshire County Council and Basingstoke and the developers are presumably going to have to finance some significant amounts of infrastructure, including not least of which is the Western Bypass. So, for example, one might not expect to see the Western Bypass on this infrastructure list because that's why they've got a 0 tariff, but nonetheless, it has a value. And so it's not on this list because we're not asking for the SIL payment by anybody else, but we've given them a 0 get out of jail free ticket on that development because they've said that they've got to spend some huge amounts of money on some really significant, important pieces of infrastructure that our town requires. So I understand what you're doing is in relation to what's being required of you by the government, but for me personally, I would find it incredibly useful to know what the costs are of, say, the Bramley Road Junction, and also a pedestrian bridge or a bridge over the railway line in Bramley, if that were to be added in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Before I go back to Mark, is there any other councillor who wants to speak to it in favour or oppose that particular suggestion from Councillor Cubitt? No, I can't see any raised hands. Okay, so sorry, Councillor Vaux is. Do you want to go next, Councillor Vaux?
Sorry, yes, I think Councillor James is also waving. My understanding of this list, though, was that these SIL allocations are a contribution towards, and therefore I wonder if what Councillor Cubitt is asking for is actually a bit academic, because the cost of something, yes, might be £1 million, but the SIL contribution to it might only be 10k. So I'm not sure of the added value, but if I've got that wrong, I'm sure Mark will put me right. That was just my understanding.
Thank you, Councillor Fox. Councillor Laura James, you also had your hand up raised in relation to that.
Yeah, well, I was sort of similar. What I was thinking about is what Onali had raised earlier about, and we was told about the SIL rating for Many Down being 0, and looking at the first item in relation to the country park. I too was concerned, and I didn't understand how much money would be taken out of the SIL if they've got a SIL rating. And it's a significant park in size, and what percentage are they going to be funding of that park against what there is an expectation of us? I mean, because that could be enormous. That could wipe out our SIL rating, our SIL budget. And I just would, I need to understand it more. I don't understand what that is about, really. So if you could help me, please.
Thank you, Councillor James. So, Mark, do you want to respond to those 3 points there?
Yeah, I think as you say, that there's a few points there to pick up. I think firstly, in terms of the point Councillor Cubitt was making, I think it's valid and it's possible in terms of some of the things listed there, such as the named junctions, for example. But it gets more challenging if you look at the page that refers to education. It refers to extensions to primary schools or extensions to secondary schools, and clearly it doesn't name, for good reason, those particular schools involved or what the extension may consist of. So to put a value on that is really quite challenging. So I think to be able to do that consistently throughout that list is going to be quite a tall order and would have limited value in that respect. And I think that picks up the point that Councillor Box made around it may only fund part of the infrastructure and that particular project rather than funding all of it. Hopefully that helps on the first 2 points.
Thank you, Mark. Yes. Yeah, I think it's in general the way I can see it, that there is a number of suggestions are coming through from councillors. I think we all recognise that this is the first time we've done this report. It's very good. It presents a lot of information. I think we're getting through a number of suggestions for improvement. I know you and the other officers are taking note of that. So I think it'll be useful if you do get the opportunity to go away and work out what we can and can't easily and usefully provide in future editions. Anything else you wanted to add to that, Mark?
I think it's just picking up on the point that Councillor James was making around the country park. Clearly that performs both a strategic function in that anybody from the borough could be expected to use it and may wish to travel there and make use of the facilities in time, but it also serves a very local function, and it serves as providing mitigation for some of the money down schemes. So it's divided there into 2 columns, so for SIL and Section 106, recognising that it performs both a local and strategic function. And I think this was the slight difficulty we had when we prepared the list a few years ago, because we weren't sure exactly what proportion of the country park would be mitigation of the development and which would serve a wider function. So in that sense, the list has been designed to be as flexible and in that respect as possible.
Just to add to what Mark Lambert's been explaining, is exclusions are delivered by the developer through a Section 106 agreement or through a commuted sum through the Section 106 agreement. So the exclusions column that you're reading in the table, it may actually be that the items that are excluded, the developer delivers, and they deliver that at whatever the cost is that's necessary to deliver it. But I take the point that what would be helpful, because clearly what's really important is that the IFS follows the regulations that we're required to actually follow, and that's all we have to, I'll say, legally report on. But what is missing, not because of this just being the first year, but because we haven't had enough projects delivered to be able to detail, is maybe some case studies which could actually detail some of the stuff that Councillor Cubitt's asking for in terms of specific sites that have delivered specific things and some insight into that. And that's something that we could look to deliver in the future report for next year.
Thank you, Ruth. It's grateful that you're giving that consideration. Councillor Laura James, any supplementary to that?
Yeah, well, picking up on what Mark was saying about the park is going to be strategic. An example, for example, is the splash pad in Popley. It is funded and delivered in Popley, but it is used by people all across the town. In fact, it's used for people outside of the town. And we could say the same about parks within Northern. People come to them, but it was funded, and at the moment, some of it is being funded by management charges of the residents that live there. So I think we need to explore that, and I'm concerned about it, I suppose. That's what I'm raising.
Thank you, Councillor James. Mark, anything to add to that? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So that's noted, Councillor James. Paul, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to support the idea of having some factual financial element to this. I know what Ruth said in terms of case studies, and I respect that. But I'm just thinking in terms of some of these will have estimates. Some of these will have specific figures set against them by the people who would be delivering them eventually. And we should have that set against how much we are considering giving out of the SIL pot towards them. So there's a clear delineation of what is going on set against the list. And on the schools, I'd quite like to know what the SIL money might be used for, were a school project to come forward, so that we can see it, not so much as a case study, but for example, that we're funding X primary school in X place with X amount of SIL money because we've chosen to do that. tracking that would be incredibly useful and informative for members on infrastructure spend across the borough. Really, it would give us a bigger strategic picture, I think. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Mark, I see you're taking notes there, so if I can leave that with you and your team, that would be much appreciated. And if we end with Councillor Cubitt, please.
Yes, sorry, just I completely agree with Councillor Harvey on that, and I thank Ruth also for her kind offer. But what I'm thinking in my head is all those really big documents that we worked through when we were working through the local plan of sustainability of each of the projects, and there was a huge or two huge volumes, and in each of the sites that we evaluated, it had loads of columns about what the monies were going to have to be used to spend on. So SUDS, school provision, road required. So each site that we evaluated back in 2011, from 2009 to be honest, had extensive information in terms of what we as a local planning authority were going to require of the site were it to be delivered. And therefore, in terms of an audit, I think an audit would be interesting, because we were told that XYZ site would have to provide an extension to the secondary school, or ABC site was going to have to provide a new primary school. So we knew that, and we know that, and that was on the basis on which we as members finally chose the final allocated sites that we chose, was based on that evidence. And Councillor Harvey's correct as well in terms of audit, because of course what I'm very, very wary of, and I've witnessed it over the 12 years I've been councillor, is that we amass pots of money and then we as councillors aren't fully cognizant of when or if they're dispersed in the ways that we were promised that they were going to be dispersed. I would be loath to hear, like Councillor Vokes suggests, that we get £10,000 towards the Chinham Junction. I'd be wary about the fact that there was a £10,000 go into a reserve. How do I know that that actually ultimately was given towards the purpose for which it was stated? So I'm not questioning your motives at all. I'm not questioning the officers at all. I think we do seem to be rather good in Basingstoke of amassing reserves, and I'm slightly wary about whether we spend them the way we promise we're going to spend them, or whether way we intend to. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. That's noted. Councillor Harvey?
Sorry, Chair. It's a point that I thought of after I stopped speaking, and it comes from Councillor Miller's earlier comments. Yep. Say there's a situation where you have a sale agreement, you're going to deliver a school. What happens in the situation where that then doesn't happen? Say the developer then doesn't deliver the school or doesn't deliver the piece of infrastructure. Is it that SIL then gets recalculated and reworked, or is it that you take the money but the money goes somewhere else? That might then not be in that community. It might be you're not then solving the disbenefit, as it were. I'm just trying to work out what happens if that piece of infrastructure, like a school, is not delivered on the site as per we would want it to be on SIL.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Mark?
I'll have a go at answering this question, if that's all right.
I think by my by one of the,
no, not at all. I think
my screen, so apologies.
I think at the end of the day, what the point is if you have a Section 106 agreement for a school to be delivered on the site, the school has to be delivered on the site. So that's actually a fact. And the only way that you can actually not deliver that school on the site is through your deed of agreement, having an amendment to that deed, which you would see at Planning Committee quite often, I'm guessing. If you're SIL, so you can have an on-site delivery of school, or alternatively, I'm going to call SIL a development tax, where you might have a development that simply just pays the development tax, which is banked by us, and that through a prioritisation process with the county, the need for the school places or school additions in certain parts of the borough is identified, agreed, and that's how the county effectively come to the authority also to confirm that an amount of SIL goes to the county, but also if there is a need, in addition, they might come to the borough with those questions. So do you know what I think the real challenge is for the authority is that because you've only been a SIL charging authority for a year, there's not enough meat on the bones in this actual report. And so it's really frustrating because you're looking at it thinking, well, where's all the money for all of the things we need to do? And that's a story that I hope we're going to be able to build on over years and time. And yes, we can actually also find out from developers for the case studies how much they actually had to spend to deliver those items as well, and get some figures on it by all means. So we're happy to take all those comments away and make it a more, I'm going to say, colourful and exciting item next year. But we also have to remind ourselves it's actually a report which is for the previous year. So it's a 2019 snapshot that you're looking at in this as well. So hopefully there'll be a lot more to tell next time.
Ruth, Mark, thank you both very much for answering that question and all the ones that came before it, and I appreciate you spending your evening with us. Before we close off this particular agenda item, Councillor Raphael, was there anything you wanted to say by way of summing up?
No, can I just thank the members for their questions, probing, helpful, and for the understanding you have as chairman that this is the first year. So I'm sure that the positive suggestions will be taken away and worked with in due course.
Thank you very much, Councillor Raphael. Thank you again, Mark and Ruth. Really appreciate that. Okay, so if we move on to tonight's main event, which is the Authority Monitoring Report. At the risk of stealing Councillor Raphael's thunder again, this has already also been published. It is there on our website and has been since the end of last year. So once again, this is the purpose of bringing it up tonight is primarily to give us all an opportunity to ask any questions that we may have. So Joe Bromley is the officer responsible for this, and we'll be speaking, I'm sure, in just a few minutes' time. But Councillor Raphael, do you want to introduce this?
Only to repeat what you've just said, because it is. It is what it is, and it updates members on what's been going on. It is obviously fixed very much up to April of last year, and there are some key things that have been fleshed out in it. The 5-year land supply, as that also relates to gypsy and traveller sites, the issues over design of buildings, and I think there was another one, but I haven't got it right in front of me at the moment. So I will listen carefully to what members say, and welcome to hear their comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Raphael. Joe, welcome to the meeting. Thank you for waiting patiently whilst we went through the previous agenda items. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I wasn't going to say much really, because Councillor Raphael has kind of set the scene for it. Only to say, I mean, you've all seen this before, because this comes every year, so you know what it is and what the purpose of it is. It's quite a useful document, particularly in the stage that we're now at with starting the local plan update and using that as we move forward. I think it's really been a continuation probably of the trends that we've seen over the last couple of years, whereas many of the policies are working really well. It's still providing a clear framework for consistent decision making on a whole raft of measures. But as Councillor Raphael said, there are a number of sort of targets as such that we've missed, and those are flagged in the report as red in the RAG status. I'm sure we will talk about those in a bit more detail. So I'm quite happy to just move on to questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Joe. Yes, so let's go straight into that. Obviously, this is a significant document, so I'm weighty too. So we'll approach this one section by section, and we'll begin with the executive summary on page 40 of the agenda packs, or page 4 if you're looking specifically at this report. I don't think there's very much to say on page 40 itself. It's just the introduction. So we'll look onto the RAG rating of these the RAG rating tables, which begin on page 41 and continue all the way through to page 51. And we'll approach this section by section because it's quite a long table. So if we can begin with housing, which starts on page 41 and actually goes all the way through to page 46. So I can see a couple of hands up already. Councillor Cubitt, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, I've, as you can imagine, I've got an awful lot of comments. Obviously, I'm not going to make them all in one go.
Yeah, so if I can encourage you as well, sorry to interrupt, Councillor Cubitt, also just to make them relevant to the part of the
absolutely.
The
so you are on page 41. No, I appreciate that. You're on page 41, yes?
We are, yes.
Yes. Okay. So what I had a look at all of the previous monitoring reports that we've been through as members, and I'd like to just remind all of the members that the purpose of this report is to evaluate the efficacy of our local plan and the accuracy of our local plan. And we have a situation which I do want to talk to all of you about, which I think is very, very, very serious, which is that our local plan, sadly, so whilst we've delivered 1,600 houses as per page 41, sorry, Mr. Chairman, you'll understand where I'm heading once you hear me out. Whilst our number of houses built on page 41 is green and looks like we're doing a wonderful job. In fact, it looks like we're doing better than normal. It actually is masking something really, really serious that has gone wrong in this borough. And what has gone wrong in this borough is that we, as members, spent the most inordinate amount of time since 2009 on a local plan. And we spent an enormous amount of money, we as a borough, on evidence, choosing sites that were going to provide housing in a well-managed, well-developed, well-controlled way. And as a borough, we did a brilliant job. Our officers did an amazing job. We had a hiccup along the way in that a site was removed in 2011, which should never have been removed. Despite the fact a huge amount of monies had been spent on that site, evaluating it as part of the evidence base. But in the main, we did an amazing job and we produced a great local plan. And that's very much in part due to a lot of the members that are here today. But nonetheless, we chose sites and they are sections 3.1 through to 3.12. And I went through the figures and they are truly horrific. And they are a terrible indictment on the delivery. Now, this is not a criticism of the officers, but it is nonetheless a fact. And the fact is this, that we promised through our plan and identified sites that were going to be good for our residents and good for our borough. And they were the sites in section 3.1 through to 3.12. And we were going to deliver these by 2029, which was the duration of our local plan. And they were chosen all based on the evidence and the money spent, evaluating the evidence, etc., yada, yada, yada. However, when you look at what we built to date, 2021, despite the fact we built 1,600 today, and I'm going to go into that data in more detail in a minute, despite the fact that we identified these sites, by this year to date, we have only built 13% of the houses that were supposed to be delivered by the plan. So I totted up the plan and I calculated those sites that have been delivered from the allocated sites, and I have calculated that 13% have been built, and we are already in 2021. Of those sites, there are 4 sites that belong to the public sector. They belong to Hampshire County Council and or ourselves. And those sites represent a significant percentage of the allocated sites. And to date, not one house has been built on those sites that belong to the local authorities. So we are in a dreadful position because we now do not have a 5-year housing supply. We then look at the figures which the officers have brilliantly put together, and but please do not take this as a criticism, officers. I am just referring to the stats, and I would like somehow for us to find out what and how we can redeem our position. But from 2020 to 2025, the numbers from the allocated sites of the local plan for which we're supposed to be evaluating the annual monitoring report that will be delivered will be 1,742, and that represents 21% of the total number of houses that were supposed to be delivered by the local plan. So if you add up what's been built so far, and then you include those that will be built that are allowed to be included in our 5-year housing supply, that only represents 34% of the total houses, and we're nearly at 2029. And when you drill down on the figures even more, of that, by the time we hit 2025, only 420 houses in total will have been built by us and Hampshire County Council, which represents local authority sites that were identified in the allocated sites. And then when you go further, of the houses that have not been built, that are in the allocated sites, that cannot be included in the 5-year housing supply, but that will be built by 2029, you then find that we have 2,753 houses that will be built by 2029, which represents a further 33% of the local allocated plan. And of those houses, 78% are relate to Basingstoke and Deane and Hampshire County Council sites. And furthermore, just finally, because I don't want to bore you all to Great Britain, but outside of the plan, so we now have 2,745 houses of the allocated sites, i.e. representing 33% of our local plan of 2011 to 2029, 33% of the houses are now not even going to be built within the period 2011 to 2029. And of those 33% that will not be built at all within our plan, 80% are sites that belong to local authority, the public sector, i.e. Hampshire County Council and Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. And my final statistic is that of the local plan, 80% of our allocated plan in our local plan will not be included, are not included, cannot be included in our current housing supply. So that's just the first thing, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to say one other thing, which relates specifically to the houses. Of the 1,600 houses that were built last year, 15% of them relate to the sites that we allocated in the local plan. Only 15%. And moreover, something like 331 were permitted development rights for which we get no affordable housing. And there's an enormous reliance that the council now has on the neighbourhood plan delivering. So all is not rosy in Basingstoke and Deane at the moment, and I have huge concerns, and I'd be very interested in what other members feel about this, because it suggests to me that whilst we do all this wonderful work and we're talking about the issues and options results, and we're going to talk about the update in the local plan, that it's all for naught. Because if none of the projected sites get developed, and we have to rely on large windfall sites which get through by inspectors' appeals because we don't have housing supply, we have no control over what on earth is going on in our borough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt, for that very well-researched question. I appreciate all of the time that's gone into compiling those statistics and sharing those with us. Joe, do you want to have a go at trying to answer as many elements of that as you possibly can?
I don't know to what extent I can answer that. I mean, there were a lot of figures there. I would need to look at those in detail, obviously, to say whether they were sort of correct as such, and I'm not sure what assumptions have been used necessarily behind that. There were just a couple of stats in there that I don't think are quite right. For example, where you're saying how many units are now falling out of the overall supply in terms of from allocations. I can't remember the figure that you used, but I think it's more like about 2,400 is the actual figure. And also the number of dwellings that came forward on local plan allocations within this year as such, or in the monitoring year, is actually more like about 38%, which is shown on page 67. So there's some issues in terms of the precise figures. But having said that and putting that aside, I think a lot of what Councillor Cubitt has said is absolutely right, that we have real delivery issues with a large number of sites. Whereas, as again, page 67 is perhaps too early to go to that page, but we're talking about housing detail now, but that shows that quite a lot of our allocations are coming forward, and that lists the completions that you've got from, for example, land north of Park Pruitt, Razors Farm, land north of Popley, Merton Rise, and also ones in the settlements as well. So there are sites that are delivering, but Councillor Cubitt is absolutely correct that certain sites are not, particularly the public owned sites. And the 4 sites that Councillor Cubitt highlighted, which are in Hampshire County Council ownership and our own, are not kind of delivering in the way that we expected, and because of that, that has led to the issues that we now have with land supply.
Is there any update you're able to provide us as to sort of why those sites, the publicly owned sites, are so slow, and if you're aware of anything that's likely to speed things up in the future?
Well, 3 of them are owned by Hampshire County Council, so I can't really speak on behalf of Hampshire County Council. That's not right.
Of course.
Do so. I mean, we work as closely as we can with them to encourage them to do so, and through the development management process, try and iron out any issues and barriers that come forward. And there are sites such as Upper Cufford Farm, Swing Swang Lane, which are now going through the process and will now contribute to the 5-year supply, but they have taken a long time to get there. We have other sites like east of Basingstoke, where there's a whole number of reasons that I'm sure Hampshire County Council would put forward, such as viability and wider strategic issues for why they haven't progressed that site as we would have hoped. But that's we know about those issues. The other big one, of course, is Manydown, and that in itself, we've lost 1,750 units from the overall supply. We've had delay for 5-6 years on that, and that now is very difficult, obviously, to catch up. There are a whole number of reasons why that has happened, but that is the position that we're now in. So we need to work as proactively as we possibly can through all aspects of the council to make sure those sites actually deliver in the way that we have predicted that they will now moving forward. But in terms of making up that gap, as Councillor Cubitt said, that's very difficult to now do.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Cubitt, we'll come back to you because I see you've got your hand raised again. Councillor Harvey, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Chair. I think what Councillor Cubitt has said and what Joe has also reflected is, I think, fundamentally, the provision of housing in Basingstoke and Deane at the moment is, I feel, in a mess. Over a third of what we're seeing on that 1,600 this year in this report reflects windfall sites. It reflects development we never expected. It reflects developers using the system, I would argue gaming the system, to gain what they choose on their site for their benefit. That's fine. But we do not always get what we want out of that, and nor what we thought we were getting through the allocated sites. The very fact that that figure has now assumed such a magnitude within the overall is a concern for me. I mean, you say on page 641 here, 50 units of windfall in the year, but it's 546 on the figures. In a sense, we're looking at what that means. I know Joe's going to tell me it might mean 2 different things. I'm sure you are, Joe. But I'm just a simple person that says, when you say we're going to deliver 50 units of qualifying small windfall sites, and actually we've got 546 on a lot bigger sites than small windfall sites, that is of a concern. I think the permitted development, and we'll come on to this later in the report, the permitted development issue is huge. And I am really, really worried by that whole figure and the percentage now that represents in our delivery. And why is it so bad? It's bad because we're not delivering our allocated sites. So the fact that Manydown is so far behind and we're going to lose 1,700 units off the figure is a real cock-up of the first order when it comes to the authority. How we got there, why we're in this place, does need to be understood, because we can't afford to make the same mistake in the new local plan. But we also have an accountability issue. There has to be some accountability for why we're in this place and we're reliant on such levels of windfall and so on. I do think it's important in terms of the trajectory of the 5-year housing land supply. It isn't getting better, it's getting worse. And it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in a sense, the worse it gets, the harder it is, the more easier it is for developers to bring forward sites we wouldn't otherwise accept. So in accepting the report and the information you've given us, and thank you very much, just on that opening page, it raises real questions of the fundamental workings of the local plan and whether the paper that it's written on really at the moment is up to standard, and how we then affect change on that, how we put that right, the remedy, the putting it right as Honor rightly identifies. If I can, Chair, if you don't mind, I've got a colleague has asked me, Councillor Tomlin asked me to ask a couple of questions that relate to page 33. If I could just enter them into the record and ask her a response, I'd be very grateful.
Please do, Councillor Harvey.
Yeah, I mean, in 12.1, and it relates to what we're talking about, actually, Chair. In 12.1, Councillor Tomlin rightly asks, the recent appeal hearing for the site in Silchester Road, Bramley, 12 bungalows, the inspector criticised the neighbourhood plan and used it to justify his allowance of the appeal. The plan did not have an actual view across the site of the impact on the conservation area, quote unquote. Should the plan have known a developer would promote that or any other field, the issue becomes one that the NDPs don't seem to be, at that context, offering the defence we thought they would. And I think that's a really important point in terms of the use of and how NDPs are being used by developers. And then the second question relates to 12.2 of the conclusions of the main report. This needs to be a significant action plan or a debate within government as we perform as an authority, but the rules penalise us when we're not delivering our due land supply against our due land supply criteria. Bramley will face at least 2 major developments of 300 and up to 950 new homes on 2 sites that might be reasonably expected not to be in the new local plan, using the 5-year housing argument if we had it at our disposal. We don't, and the same for Sherfield. I had this comment from a resident. While the council has yet again a bumpy year in its housing delivery, 1,200 homes delivered, and then now the previous year, 2019, 1,600 homes in 2020, the 5-year housing land supply figure is reducing. It is now only 4.4 years of housing land. So the situation is getting worse and not better. Of interest is that the number of new homes delivered on allocated sites has also reduced. The bulk of it, 62% of our housing delivery in 2019 and 2020, come from windfalls, appeals and permitted development. 62% come from those areas alone. So Councillor Tomlin's questions, which I'd asked to ask, are very relevant to the very question we're asking, Chair. If officers could respond in writing, I think that would be appreciated so that we could all have an answer in response to Councillor Tomlin. But they relate to what we're talking about right now, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Harvey. Joe, I'll come back to you in just a second. I'd just like to point out it's very close to 8 o'clock. So I'd like to invite everyone in the meeting to join me in applauding our heroes for 30 seconds, just like we did last week. So if you can make sure that you're on mute, otherwise we'll get a cacophony of noise, which I don't think will be very pleasant for anyone. We'll begin right away. Thank you all very much for that. That's our 30 seconds up. So, Joe, do you want to respond to any of those points?
I was just going to say, in terms of kind of the breakdown things, I completely understand the point about allocations. Just to say something on the windfall, as Councillor Harvey said that I would. I mean, we do expect a certain number of small site windfalls to come forward. They are part of the spatial strategy and the plan, so I wouldn't say that that's something that we wouldn't welcome. We expect those sites to come forward, and we've got the policy framework to allow those sites to come forward. The same for the large sites. Windfall sites are not necessarily a bad thing just because they're not allocated. It could be sites that come forward which are still in line with policy. So sites that come forward on brownfield land, for example, within built-up areas would all be counted as windfall, and therefore, again, are in line with the plan. So I wouldn't necessarily see sort of allocations versus windfall as the way to look at it. It's much more complicated than that. For example, the Orham site, which has come forward and delivered a large number of units this year, is down as a windfall, but it was in line with policy. And there's numerous examples of that. So it's perhaps slightly more complicated than people may think. The permitted development, yes, but again, it doesn't really matter what our land supply position is in permitted development. We will always look at those on a site-by-site basis in terms of the scheme. So even if we had a full land supply, it doesn't mean that we would then not have the permitted development. It's not sort of one or the other. In terms of the specific questions, I wasn't sure what paragraphs you were referring to, Councillor Harvey, but yeah, I tend to agree with you in terms of the overall issues that yes, I mean, we are in the land supply position that we are in, and it is very frustrating for everyone involved, I think, that some of these allocations have not come forward, particularly on the public sector land, as we expected them to.
Thank you, Joe. The paragraphs that Councillor Harvey were referring to were actually in the introduction to the report. So in the, I'm not sure if you've got the full report, but it's on page 33 or page 11 of 13 of Councillor Fell's introduction.
Yes, the summary and decisions. that one.
Yeah. Are you okay to get back to either Councillor Harvey or Councillor Tomlin with some written answers to those questions?
Yes, yeah, that's no problem.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Councillor Laura James is next.
Thank you. Joe, in relation to what you were saying about windfall, I have concerns in relation to what's been raised tonight in relation to the percentage of windfall and also permitted development that makes up our housing numbers. But I understand that there's 50 in number for small windfall sites, but the figure of 546 windfall sites in relation to the larger developments, that isn't accounted for in our housing numbers. So if they were part of the allocation, they would be accounted for, and then we wouldn't be in the position possibly that we're in now in relation to the 5-year land supply. Am I right on that? So what I'm concerned about is, why are these sites not coming forward? They're sort of unmanaged in a sense, and I'm not saying they're not a bad thing. Chapelgate, for example, was a windfall. Why wasn't it part of the allocation?
What we tend to do with the last local plan is that we didn't allocate sites within built-up areas, so sites that could come forward anyway through the policy framework, we didn't allocate. We may choose to do a different approach in the local plan update now and do that to kind of show and provide more certainty in terms of where those sites are going to come forward. But as I said, they're still coming forward in line with the policy framework, so they're not necessarily sort of seen as negative development. In fact, we would expect windfall sites to come forward, and that's part of the spatial strategy. Part of the argument that we made actually through the local plan examination last time, and why we didn't allocate reserve sites and things, was because we didn't have a large site allowance. And we said because of this large site for windfall allowance, that would be expected to come forward and would bring up a certain amount of supply anyway. So that was part of that argument. It gives us a certain amount of flexibility in terms of our figures. But all of these units still count towards supply. It's not just allocations that count. All of them will count. So anything that's developed will count towards our supply. So from that point of view, it doesn't matter.
Thanks, Joe. Councillor James, does that answer your question?
It does. I've got a couple more on that page, if I can just
Okay, fire away.
Yeah, going down the third point in relation to percentage of homes built on previously developed land. In grey, you reference permitted development in relation to 47%. Is that really what is meant by that, or is that more? Was it meant to be something else? I'm not sure. Or is that what we're wanting there in that instance? And the other one I wanted to raise in the bottom in relation to regeneration, I suppose I'm horrified yet again we haven't delivered anything. That's 200 units. We didn't. I think this is the third year running. I know we all in a committee have said we were not happy at all with the regeneration strategy, and we wanted it to come back to the committee. In the report, in the body of the report, it talks about Winkleberry coming forward. I mean, it's been talking about Winkleberry coming forward for the last 3 years. There's some other aspects of it that I would like to raise later on in the report that talk about Norden, but I'm just exceptionally disappointed, and I don't think it's good enough, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor James. Joe?
Just in terms of the previously developed land, so really that's a split where we show how much development came forward on greenfield compared to brownfield. So that is to show with a 47%, which is quite high, is on previously developed or brownfield land. So that figure really reflects what we've been talking about in terms of the amount of developments that have come forward within built-up areas and also through permitted development. So that reflects that. In terms of regeneration, as you said, the Winkleberry scheme it's the big one that will probably meet that figure, but at the moment is not advanced enough that we can report it in here.
Thanks, Joe. Councillor George, you want to go next?
Thank you, Chair. I thought I was lower in the queue, but I'm very happy to do that's the case. Joe, thank you very much for a very comprehensive report. It's clearly very, very comprehensive indeed, and we're never going to get it through it all tonight, I'm sure. But what I suppose, this is something I know which is very close to your heart, and the concern I've got is, I think if you look at very much as quite a number of these sites and what is going to be delivered by 2029, I think the neighbourhood plans basically are going to be almost built out. Certainly where we are in Whitchurch, our full allocation is going to be built out easily by the end of that period. The only issue we've got is that given the 5-year land supply, we are probably, so best I can say, suddenly now be having to take on board sites, big, large applications now, which go way beyond what we were originally allocated in the local plan in terms of numbers. And because of the tilted balance position with this 5-year land supply, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually basically fight those. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. So it's going to be very difficult to do that. The big concern I've got is number one, what that does for localism, because a lot of these plans were sold to communities on the basis that we are very much here going to allocate these sites, and this is what the town's going to expect over this period, and very much contrary to what's happened with the local plan itself, which will not deliver on those sites. A lot of the neighbourhood plans have delivered and are going to deliver way above that. And I'm really, really concerned with the effect that's going to have on localism, and the fact that, chairs of these plans and everything else in the councils have been selling this as a really good thing for the community. And the reality is, frankly, they're going to get way, way beyond, and it's going to really affect the morale and ability to take this whole program going forward. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that or what we can do to try and reassure people. But at the moment, I'm really concerned, because people I've been talking to are saying, well, what's the point of having a neighbourhood plan? Because it's just because of the 5-year land supply, we've got absolutely nothing. There's nothing we can do about it.
Thank you, Councillor George. Joe?
I would absolutely agree. Yes, I mean, the neighbourhood plans across the board have delivered well, as you've said, and that part of the spatial strategy has met all the aims that we put forward to it, and communities have stepped forward and done what we asked them to do. I mean, when we go out now, when we speak to obviously the relevant communities who have done neighbourhood plans, we can see that exactly as you say, that frustration is coming through, and we'll have to see how we move forward on that. I mean, we are where we are. I mean, there's no kind of thing that I can say to change that. We will obviously need to consider this a lot through the next local plan update as we move forward now for allocations in coming years, in terms of that split. Deliverability of sites has got to be key in that, and how that split works. But you're right that it can't be the case that the rural areas are penalised as such in that next spatial strategy just because they've delivered, whereas others haven't. So we'll need to make sure all those issues are fully considered.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Councillor George. Councillor Cubitt, I know you've had your hand up and you've been waiting patiently for a while. I'm just going to ask a few other people who haven't yet spoken, but I'll make sure I definitely come back to you before we finish this section. So next up, I've got Councillor Watts, Gary Watts.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with all the previous speakers. I mean, I've been saying it for years, we've lost control of the local plan. But we have our hands tied by central government. I just wonder if there's any appetite within the committee to write to the government about this absurd 5-year land supply. Bloody children. Yeah, whatever happened to localism, as Councillor George said? This is all top-down measures. And we talk about regeneration. I've been back on this council 10 years, and South Ham has been a part of that regeneration. And we've had nothing, absolutely nothing. And the previous administration, Labour and Liberal administration, we delivered vast sites of regeneration. This administration has actually done negligible, what I can remember. And pointing on to whatever members were saying, we've got 22% of our completions is permitted developments, something we have no control over at all, giving no affordability, no 106, no SIL, no benefit to the community. And as the report goes on, these are substandard homes as well, and we're building up problems for the future. And I just think we as a council, we should be writing to the government again about the 5-year land supply, top-down targets and permitted developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watts. Councillor O'Farrell, I'm going to come to you and put you on the spot, if I may. I think the committee have expressed a number of concerns about our performance relative to the local plan. Is there anything you want to say or sort of take away from all those comments to date?
Well, there is actually, and I was just holding back because this is very much a question of clarification and points being made with the officers, and you've been doing that very clearly. And obviously, if I step into the fray, it could become an opportunity for political point scoring, which of course deflects away from the maturity of the discussion that you've been having so far. I want to just remind people of several things which we all are aware of. And it is a trite point to begin with, that large sites take longer to be successfully developed. In other words, once the planning process starts, they hide complexities and they have the potential to have complex 106 agreements. So some of the larger sites that even gone through Development Control Committee at the moment are being stalled due to complex legal issues that need to be dealt with. And I am encouraging as much as I possibly can that the officers take a proactive role to make sure that it's not on their side that matters are slowing. With the larger sites that Councillor Cubitt has identified that are in public ownership or publicly being promoted, we over 3, 4, 5 years, certainly going back, have been trying to encourage the landowners to get on with it. And it is odd that one of those landowners to the site to the east of Basingstoke was advised by us to, well, you should put the whole 900 in because you've got a much more viable site. No, we want to put 450 in. So 450 go in the local plan. Oh, no. Despite with the fact we've put it forward in the local plan, we don't want to promote it within the timescales we said. And what can you do about it? You can cajole them, encourage them, but they are the master of their land just as much as a private developer is. And it is a source of frustration. And then they sort of indicate, well, it's much better to develop it as 900. So maybe we will. And it's that sort of vacillation, is perhaps a much more neutral word than anything else I can think of, that we've had to contend with. And then when we come to the site at Manydown, the northern part of Manydown, which we're also familiar with, this committee, in its previous incarnation as Planning and Infrastructure Committee, said repeatedly, with different arguments and different ways of looking at the same problem, that transport was going to be the major problem that it would have to contend with that site. We said, and I say we because I said it, as well as you as a committee, that there needed to be a combination of a relief road outside of the site and in a road that served the housing and was seen as a distribution, a balance between the two. Oh, no, said the landowners. We can solve it. And it took a mighty long time to solve it. And solve it did to the satisfaction of Development Control Committee, but probably after about 2.5 years. And you are looking for lessons to learn. Well, the obvious ones that come to mind at the moment, which sound trite, again, because they may not be the full answer and they may not be acceptable in every case, is that public authorities shouldn't be allowed to have large land holdings, which they then bring to development control for development, because they're incapable of doing that size of job and at the same time enforcing planning policies upon them. Because it just slows them down with the nightmare of confusion and detail that they have to deal with. We're great at development control when it's not our land. We're great at enforcing policy when it's not our land. But when it is our land, it seems to just take an inordinate amount of time. Maybe because one side doesn't want to instruct lawyers to deal with the issues that the other side has put up at the public's expense, perhaps. But in any event, I would say that's one solution. I would say that now that we have got through all of this, clearly the pain of all of that will mean that the outcome will come right in due course. But meanwhile, as Councillor George has said, communities that quite probably have wanted to shape their future through neighbourhood planning have now found that in reality, it's thank you very much and can we have some more? And that is horrendous. And I do agree with all members that this policy of a lack of 5-year land supply is atrocious. And I also agree that it hasn't been said, but I know that members, I think, agree it. It would be interesting for them to say it, that setting a target of 300,000 new homes per year and somehow or other creating a methodology that expects us to increase our number, perhaps from 850, if it's 864 or something at the moment, but above that, is crass when applied to Basingstoke and Deane. It may be good in other areas of the country. It might be a good policy to say that we care about providing new homes for new families or whatever. But as far as Basingstoke and Deane is concerned, we're at the upper end, and we can deliver. And the cycle we work within is an up and down. It always has been. We get huge surges of building as we're currently in, and we were some years back. And then we get significant dips. And they don't necessarily work in tandem or in parallel to economic recession. They may well be just simply the way that the market works. And us prescribing things becomes more complicated because our number is so high, the ability for us to get out of sync with what is required of us is a lot graver. And if we're being held as hostage by a few large sites to deliver our housing number, then potentially when some of those large sites, especially if they're in the same land ownership, can't be fulfilled, then this is the result that occurs. And all of this, I would say, is part of a very difficult learning curve that we're on. It's not one that any of us wanted. None of us envisaged this at the start. In fact, indeed, I'm sorry to say this, but collectively as councillors on this committee, I think we all probably thought that because we owned the sites, things would speed up. We'll be fine. But of course, that hasn't happened. And I would perhaps say another learning point to come out of this is if developers want to come forward with developing sites as part of the local plan update in due course, and site selections come forward for any site over 1,000. I take that as a rough number. It could be 800, it could be 750, it could be something smaller. We as a committee, and perhaps myself as cabinet member, if I'm still cabinet member at that point, should perhaps look with a great deal of caution at those sites, because if that developer or landowner either gets themselves stuck with dealing with complex problems, 106 agreements, or simply doesn't choose to go forward, all of this will repeat itself. And so therefore it's his smaller sites, perhaps under 500, that should be coming forward and we should be looking for, perhaps. Of course, we'll deal with it site by site as we will do in due course, perhaps later this year. But I'm just saying, I'm listening to everything you're saying and I'm very sympathetic. But we are sharing online mutual frustration at the fact that we didn't want this to be like this. And behind the scenes and in every way I can, I've been encouraging officers to meet with developers to push things on. And boy, we've been cracking the whip with our council partners to crack things on. And eventually we got through some of that with the many down planning application. But this process must not repeat itself in the future now that we've learned from it. And I'm committed to that just as much as every member from whatever political party is committed to that too. So I've spoken now, and perhaps I won't need to say anything at the end now. But Chairman, thank you for asking me. But that's what I wanted to say. You're making valid points in your own different ways, and we're all in agreement that we shouldn't be here now. And if we knew this was going to happen, I don't know what we would have done, but we certainly would have tried to design things differently. And I hope you share some of the learning points I'm taking, and hopefully you'll come up with some more too, please.
Thank you, Councillor Raphael. Thank you for sharing those frustrations with us. Just one thing that springs to mind is have you shared these frustrations with your colleagues in central government? Are they aware of the difficulties we're having here as a council? And if not, can we please pass those on?
The answer to the second part of your question is yes, we can pass it on, and I will discuss this with the leader. But I can say the answer to your first question is, oh my goodness, repeatedly we are saying things, and we've written formally, openly before on these topics as they come round. And if it is time for another letter, then I'm sure we'll do it. Members don't need to request that I do one. I will undertake to consider what the appropriate letter is and inform members afterwards and share it with them.
Thank you, Councillor Raphael. Councillor Gavin James, next.
Thank you, Chair. I shall join the annual moaning rant, I think is what AMR stands for. Certainly on affordable housing, to share everyone's concern about that, obviously, because it's getting to the point where about a third of my ward, I think, is now is basically office conversions. And so it's very frustrating to have absolutely zero 106, no affordable housing. Certainly within the figures, 1,500 new homes this year. We're proud of the fact we beat our 300 affordable homes, but let's not forget we actually got 30% affordable, not 40% this year. And obviously in previous years, those short years, we were short overall and short on affordable. We've caught up the numbers a bit. We haven't caught up the affordable anywhere near as much, which is really frustrating. But in terms of our ability to control that, Councillor Raphael moved a motion 2 years ago to get the council's full support to write a letter to government to say, can we get rid of permitted development rights, because they're really frustrating us in terms of delivering the housing that the communities need. In response to his letter, the government have extended and expanded permitted development rights to whole new levels. So I would not bother writing a letter to the government because they completely ignore it. I think we've got to accept that when it came back to take back control, they weren't talking about anything European. It was about starving local government of funding and then making sure that we had no control over our planning. And that's where we've ended up in a situation we're in. So we're absolutely right. Councillor George is completely right. We do not have any control anymore. And unfortunately, we are going to get some very, very poor development that we can't control. It's a national decision. It's a government policy. There's not much we can do about that, apart from obviously change national government. A few years away, maybe we can scare them out of it. In relation to delays to big sites, Councillor Bell's absolutely right. If one of the biggest problems we've got, a big site disappears, suddenly your 5-year land supply disappears and things get pushed back. But for him to say that it's not where we want it to be, I think he needs to reflect on his predecessors, because in relation to Manydown, in relation to Piatt's Hill and places like that, this is exactly where they wanted to be. They campaigned very, very heavily to be here. Only Cubitt resigned from the Conservative Party and sat as an independent because they delayed Manydown so much. So it was deliberate Conservative action. They spent 15 years campaigning hard to be exactly where we are. So we should not forget that. This is a Conservative failure nationally and locally. And until we're honest with ourselves, things will not change. So we've got to learn from that. The terrible mistakes made by your predecessors as Conservatives, we've got to learn from them. But we also need to just tell people, if you want to take back control, if you want to stop these disastrous things happening, we've got to stop voting Conservative. And it's incumbent upon all of us, and I appreciate some members of this committee will find it harder than me, to tell the public not to vote Conservative under any circumstances, especially in local government. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor James. Councillor Waldridge.
Absolute twaddle.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think a couple of people have jumped in before me about the point about permitted development, which I absolutely strongly agree with. It's absolutely abhorrent. There's some terrible permitted developments throughout the town and certainly in Norden. So I was going to, I put forward the idea of writing to the government about that, but I'd be also interested to know from the officers, is there absolutely anything at all we can do to sort of reduce them in any way, shape or form? I know planning doesn't allow it, but I'd be interested to hear if there's anything we can do to stop them. I've got a question about the affordable housing. How much of that affordable housing is actually social housing? Is any of it social housing? Because as we all know, affordable housing isn't actually affordable for all people on the housing register. And a particular question, I don't know if I'm jumping a little bit far ahead now, page 43, about the housing.
That's fine, Councillor Waldridge.
Housing for older people with support needs. The fact that we've got sort of two years running now where it seems that no housing of that sort has been built at all. Is that a cause for concern for officers? So I'll be interested in their views on that, please. So that's my 3 questions for now. I may well have some more later, but if we start with those 3, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Joe, do you want to have a go at those 3 questions?
Nothing kind of immediately comes to mind in terms of what you can do to actually stop permitted development, because obviously we need to sort of abide by the guidelines and rules with that and take each of them on their merits. As you said, the government is actually kind of expanding PD rights at the moment, and we'll have to see where that leads us. They have done a report, I think it was last year, which actually showed the negative impacts of permitted development. So I think the government's beginning to realise the outcomes of this sort of development, and they have said in April that national design space standards will now apply to permitted development. So that's a positive move. Whether that continues, we will have to wait and see, but we have to obviously work within the guidelines that we have. Your last question, I didn't quite catch it, but I think it was about older persons, was it? And the lack of sort of developments coming forward on that.
That's right, yeah. It's bottom of page 43.
Yeah, we didn't have any schemes of a sufficient scale that came in over this monitoring year. So that's why nothing came forward and has sort of been captured there.
Yeah.
It is an issue that we're quite aware of in terms of the next local plan and whether we change that policy and review it to make sure that it is actually delivering what it needs to in terms of older persons, because that policy, when you look at it, hasn't delivered many units because of the scale, basically because of the cut-off point. So that's why, and yes, that's definitely something that we've sort of flagged as something to look at. In terms of the affordable housing, that's kind of jumping forward to another section. I was just trying to find where that was, because that does include a split in terms of intermediate and rent. So that is in there. I can't...
Well, perhaps we'll come back to that one if you're both happy to do that.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Does that satisfy those 2 parts, the first 2 questions, Aldridge?
I'll just... I'd like a little bit more about if anything more proactive can be done in this plan about how older persons and support need housing. You know, I know you're monitoring it and you're sort of it's an issue, but is there anything that we can do proactively with RSLs about that, or other providers about that to bring it forward? And how much of an issue is it for us, given the increasing ageing population? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is a growing sort of issue for us. We are doing all we can in policy at the moment to look at kind of flexible and adaptable homes and going that way rather than sort of specific older persons housing, to make that actually our housing stock more flexible. So that's something that we can do already within existing policy, and that's something that's in the SPD as well. The supplementary planning document, to really kind of push that element. So we are doing as much as we can on individual applications under the current plan. But as I said, that's something that we will look at moving forward as well.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Cubitt, you've been waiting very patiently. So
yeah, thank you very much. Just very, very quickly on the figure that Joe questioned, I added 450 because I categorised east of Basingstoke as a 900er. And I included that on the stats that I calculated as well. So for outside the 29, 2,745 is 1,750 of Manydown, 450 of east of Basingstoke that's part of the 900 and a 545. In terms of the comment that you made about your 38% on page 67, that 38% has an enormous amount of neighbourhood planning delivery. And that's where you've been able to use that figure, and that's why I say 15% is actually the true figure. And that then kind of goes back to the point that Councillor George has made and various other members have made, which is that whilst the neighbourhood plans were seen as supporting and defending the realm, i.e. the parishes concerned, actually they've ended up being the principal deliverer of housing for the whole borough. which was absolutely not what was expected. And that's why they feel unhappy, and they have every right to feel unhappy, because when you go to the back of the annual monitoring report, members, I'm sure you notice that Appendix 4 is all about evaluating and auditing the delivery of the neighbourhood plan, and yet we don't audit and evaluate the delivery of the main plan, which was the 8,288 as amended when taking into account increased delivery on the private sector. And finally, and furthermore, it is extraordinary that the private sector has delivered and the public sector has not. And I thank Councillor Rafael for his comments. But I'm sorry, I find it wholly unacceptable that we find it difficult to negotiate a Section 106 with the public sector. I mean, these are sites that belong to the taxpayer. This one site, Many Down, was bought in 1996. And I didn't resign, I was sacked, Councillor James. I was sacked as a Conservative, and I'm a staunch Conservative, and I remain a staunch Conservative. But a site that was bought with the proceeds of the sale of the council housing stock, to have been bought in 1996 and to still not have had one house delivered, and to have been in our allocated plan, and to have been instructed as a borough by Justice Lindblom to include it in our development, and still for there not to be one house, is a disgrace. And it's not the officers' fault, so I'm not blaming the officers, I'm afraid. I don't know who to blame. Anyway, in terms of the red, green and things, I think, and I don't know what everybody else thinks, but I think that the number of homes built, because it's actually masking a failure of our local plan, should actually be in red. Because I think that the evaluation of numbers of houses built should be in relation to the local plan.
Sorry, Councillor Cubitt, just to interrupt you there. This has already been published, so we're not going to be able to change it retrospectively, I'm afraid. So I completely agree with you on the point, both personally and sort of politically. But this document is published as is, so we're not going to change it.
I hear you, Mr. Chairman, but actually, I actually think there should be an amendment to the submission to the local government authority, because I don't think it's accurate. Because if you were auditing this, you would think, oh, brilliant, Basingstoke's brilliant. They built 1,600 houses. But actually, this audit is supposed to be an audit of how effective our local plan is. And our local plan, we have built 13% of our local plan, and we're now 2021. So I hear what you're saying, Mr. Chairman, but I actually would like to see this amended. And I would also like to see red put in many more categories. So regeneration, I completely agree with comments made by members, particularly Councillor Woolridge. Regeneration hasn't happened for the last 2 years. That should be in red. Housing for older people should be in red. I mean, the amount of times, and Councillor Watt makes references to it, and Councillor James makes references to it, the amount of times I've sat in the meetings where I've heard that we are going to do all these wonderful things and regenerate Basingstoke town, and what have we done? I'm sorry, it's just completely not acceptable. And I don't know whose fault it is. And again, there are a whole host of sections here which are not in green and not in red. They're in grey, which suggests that they're all hunky-dory, and they're not hunky-dory. So why is it that the private sector manages to deliver? Why is it that the private sector has managed to meet the requirements of our allocated sites? Why is it the public sector has completely failed, and who is to blame? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Does anybody, with a show of hands, does anybody share Councillor Cubitt's view around the potential reclassification of some of these colours? There do seem to be quite a number of raised hands. So if I go first to Joe, because I think you want a point to make, and then Councillor Rafael, I'll then move on to you because you had your hand raised anyway. So let's address those points. Joe first.
I was just going to say, in terms of the RAG rating, I mean, where you've got a red or a green, that's really where it's against the figures are against an actual target in the local plan. So with the actual completions, for example, that is an actual target in there of 850 a year. So it's green because we have met that target. To change that to red would be strange to do that because the target has been met. I can understand what Councillor Cubitt is saying, and that is why the red comes under the housing land supply, and that is picked up through that. where you've got grey, that was kind of something that the EPH committee wanted to be grey back in the past, because for those particular issues, there wasn't a straightforward sort of figure or a yes or no answer. So it was agreed that a grey would be the best way to explain that. And for things like regeneration, some of the others, those totals or targets are over the whole plan period. So you couldn't at this point say that that's failed, that target, because there's still obviously a considerable amount of time of the plan period yet to run. So again, to do that would probably be disingenuous. Just to make those points.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Raphael.
Chairman, the difficulty of coming to me is, as you did earlier, as a result in other people want to make silly political points. And we've had two from Councillor Gavin James, I'm afraid, and I have to correct them because they are wrong. I did not write to the Secretary of State or the Housing Minister to say we should get rid of permitted development. The committee know that because we discussed what I was going to say. What I did say was that we welcome the fact that new homes have been created and that old employment offices had become homes for people where otherwise the buildings would have had to either lie derelict or be knocked down and repurposed and rebuilt. But what I said was that, and I've said this many times, the consequences of making significant changes to the planning system create unintended consequences. And the government needed to address the unintended consequences, which were that we didn't have any control of design standards or the amount of space within those homes. We couldn't put conditions on the fact that where what was previously an office suddenly became a home, and people needed facilities and services to support that in an urban environment, and we had absolutely no means of that being addressed, and one or two others besides, and we addressed that fact as part of a consultation. So that's the first thing he got wrong. The second thing is this.
Can I just come back there, Chairman?
Sorry,
I've just been referred to as making silly comments, and the Councillor Raphael has just confirmed exactly what I said, that he contacted central government to get the rules changed around permitted development rights, and they've now been extended, which is factually correct. So why am I being silly or making silly remarks when I'm making factually correct marks? I think Councillor Raphael should apologise for referring to as silly. He may not like them. He may have changed his mind. He's possibly scared of his own party. But I did not say anything.
Well, Chairman, you're going to allow him to keep speaking, or you're going to shut him down, because he's wrong. He just accused me of writing to the Secretary of State to say to get rid of permitted development, which I didn't, and I've given my explanation. Can I move on to my next point, which was this?
I'd be grateful if we could move on as a committee, please. Yes,
Chairman, it's wrong to say that whatever happened with the history of the Mellydown development coming forward influenced the delay after 2016. The site was being promoted as starting to be delivering units within the first 5 years of this current local plan, when the local plan was promoted in 2016 and passed. What had happened prior to that, therefore, has no influence whatsoever on the delays that happened thereafter. It could not possibly have had any influence on it. So to say that it did is simply balderdash. When the council came together finally, and we can all accept that wrong decisions were made prior to that, but when it came together finally to agree that the site was in the local plan and it would be delivered, it's because of the size of the site and potentially all the complexity of having local government talking to local government, that it may have some contributing factors to it being promoted slower than it should be. And it's a lesson to be learnt for the future, that the local government should not own land, perhaps, that should be promoted for housing. And some people may disagree with that view, but that is a lesson that may be learnable from it. And so that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Councillor Raphael. In relation to the point that the committee made regarding potentially reclassifying some of these RAG ratings, did you have any comments on that? Potentially looking again, obviously, Joe has
we
made
don't
some
have
there.
The power to do it. It's an officer report. It's been gone and published, but the officers can take note of what you're saying and consider it for the future. So you can talk about it for the next half an hour if you want, but you're not going to achieve anything from it. Remember, this is an officer report, not a cabinet or a member report.
Thank you, Councillor Raphael. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I feel strongly that what we're talking about this evening in terms of the local plan needs putting into some sense of practice going forward. The practical outcome of any debate this evening has got to be that things change in the context of the new revised local plan, such that we don't make the same mistakes. And we can debate this evening, and we can have a really good political debate if people want to, and they obviously are. And I understand that. But the reality is there are some stark things in this AMR that really stand out, such as there have been no regeneration units delivered against the local plan. The fact that the density of the developments we are seeing is increasing. 54% of dwellings were built at a density exceeding 30 dBH, up from 44% the year previous. The fact that we have no older people's accommodation being delivered set against the local plan. The fact of the development rights, as you've rightly said, the permitted development rights being such a dominant feature of what we're seeing delivered. And also the windfall sites, as we've had debated. So, Chair, I think I could easily say that the private sector and the public sector have both not helped us, in all honesty, because that's the truth of the matter. Private developers, land bank, and the public sector, because of the vehicle that we chose as a council to seek to deliver many down with, has cost us the years. Other local authorities are perfectly capable of doing really, really good development in the way they choose to. We chose to go down the route we went down, and it's fine, and it's cost us years. But the implication of that for then this side of the council is that, Mark, you're left holding the baby, as it were, because you've lost your 5-year housing land supply. And that's the reality of what, in a sense, has been the decisions made in the last few years. The county council is reprehensible. I really feel so strongly about the county council and how it has failed its responsibility and played games in that regard with our borough. And that's had a massive impact on where you are now. And again, it's the baby you're left holding, Mark, because what can you do other than what you have done and protest when our county council completely and utterly ignores us? And I feel very strongly about that. But again, it's the lessons learned for our local plan, because we've allowed them to do that through our local plan. So we need to close that door and stop that. All government, I think, have screwed up royally when it comes to planning. I thought the best thing the Tories did when they came into office was the Localism Act. I've got to be honest, that was a brilliant piece of legislation. It's been utterly betrayed for the past 5 years by the government. And again, it's a Tory government. So in that sense, it's really sad. Similarly so, I thought the very best thing the Labour government did when we were in control, the Labour government was in power, was the delivery of Oakridge. One of the things we did in terms of Oakridge as a council was brilliant. Each political party, each government fails when you wind up with a local versus central battle. And that's why I have fundamental disregard for party politics, because there is a sense where in central government, it's the central local battle. And we're caught on the end of that at the moment on the permitted development rights. And I do feel strongly about that. So I would really ask us, when we look at all these points, and you're right, Mark, we can't necessarily change the colours now. I wish we could, because I'd love to turn a few of them red, because it's the reality of what I think they're actually telling us. What lessons can we learn? So, Chair, practically, are we going to have a working group set up to go through the lessons learned? How do we work this, Ruth, how do we work this into the new local plan? Because there's some pretty fundamental lessons we have got to learn. Otherwise, what's the point of this? What is the point? We're going to make the same mistakes again, and we can't afford to do that. We really cannot afford to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Personally, I agree with those points. Joe, Ruth, I'll perhaps, unless you want to answer now, perhaps that's one for you to take away and have a think about, but because clearly there are some important lessons learned, I think, from all sides of the political spectrum going forward. But Ruth, I can see you've unmuted yourself, so if you do want to respond.
I was just going to say that's the purpose of the EPH map and working with the members and having those conversations and developing those policies in the early part, through that forum. So really welcome that suggestion, because that's exactly what Joe and the team are looking forward to doing with you all.
Ruth,
thank you, Ruth.
Yeah, may I give
Councillor Harvey?
Could I give you a really practical example? You've got in green on page 43, the consent was given for 25 new affordable housing units in the monitoring year. All right, we've delivered 494 in the previous paragraph, in the previous section, but simply giving consent to 25 units within 1 year is shocking, because the problem that creates looking forward is a real issue of the supply of affordable housing going forward, if all we've given is consent to 25 in a year. And again, that's the point again that others have made, which it is not consistent. It's up and down. It's all over the place. And we're not seeing consistency in the delivery of the very kind of housing we desperately need. So I think that should have been read as just as one example, because while you are getting consents, it sure as hell isn't where the consents should be compared to 146 that were given consent in 1819. It's a massive fall off. It's just one example of the point I'm making.
Yeah, I think that you've all made lots of really valid points in relation to this table, because on reading through it, I think quite a lot of us might actually reflect on some of the grey areas in this way. But I do have to support the way the officers have approached it, and I think that the paragraph at the very bottom of page 40 of the agenda's really helpful, because it explains to us all why we've got these grey sections. But we can reflect on that we're obviously hearing your comments, and we can reflect on that for next year. But I do refer, I feel that because there's a very clear explanation as to why things are red or green or grey in this document, having read that and then gone through the table, it's quite clear that this assessment's based on what's happened in the year, which is the year being reported on. But I can appreciate that over the life of the whole of the local plan, what does that mean? And that's the question you're all raising. So that's good. I think that Joe and the team, myself, we've all heard that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Councillor Laura James.
Thank you. Paul picked up on one of the points that I was going to raise around the actual around the percentage of the delivery of affordable housing. And it goes on in the report then to reflect on the 70-30 split. And again, my concern is
I think, sorry, Councillor James, sorry to interrupt you. I think we're going to talk about the 70-30 split, about the affordable social a little bit later on. So if I can ask you just to hold that question until then, that would be
okay. That's fine.
That would be helpful.
Yeah,
did you have anything else to say?
Well, really, I suppose I want to capture as well what has been said, that we come to these committees and we have these debates and we all air our view, and then we just go away and nothing happens. I think as a chair, you need to look at the areas that we have raised as concerns. And I know that we're going to have the maps and we're going to look at this, but there's some of the policy areas that we really then need to take back into the committee to think about and to do some work on, either in individual small groups that come back to the committee or as a committee as a whole. And I don't just want this to become a talking shop, and I really object to this becoming political football playing, and I don't want that in this committee. So, Chair, I'd ask you that doesn't happen again. But what I want it to do is that we really look at the areas and the concerns that we have all raised, and what are we going to do about it? It's not good enough. We do this each time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor James. No, I agree. I like you, I don't want this to become a talking shop either. I think, as Ruth has pointed out, there are a number of opportunities over the coming weeks for us to feed back and to help shape the decisions made going forward. I'd encourage us all to actively participate in those. We've all been invited to them. If we still believe that there are some gaps remaining, that some areas haven't been dealt with, then by all means, let's have another conversation and see if any additional work needs to be done. But I'm hopeful that because of the number of map sessions that are booked in, plus the regular meetings that we have, that I think hopefully the vast majority, if not all of our concerns, will be addressed there. But please do keep that in mind. And if you do feel as though we're letting anything slip through the cracks, I'm sure you'll let us know, and we can then take that forward. Councillor George.
Thank you, Chair. I must bow to other people's knowledge of the history of this, because I'm a relatively new councillor, really, although it's been nearly 3 years now. But one thing I was going to ask is I hear this problem of delivery and what is one of complexity. Could I ask very quickly? It seems to me as if, I don't know, and it's around Section 106 agreements and things like that. Could I ask very simply, the fact that we took SIL away from these people and tried to do everything through 106, was that should we say, an error? In other words, has that increased the complexity by adding much more in the Section 106 that should have been there? And if the money was given us in terms of SIL money, we would have decided where to do it rather than it being done through Section 106. Is that something we could consider as a lesson learned?
Joe, is that one for you, or Ruth? I think Ruth, you were slightly quicker to switch your microphone off, so I'll go to you first.
So, so basically, it's not that actually that simple, but the strategic viability in relation to the sites that the members will be selecting going forward for the new local plan will look at what sites are viable and whether there are sites that would need to be SIL exempt. I don't think whether a site is SIL exempt or whether there's an on-site Section 106 agreement, whether that's actually the reason why you have, I'll say, delayed delivery. Sometimes it's more around other factors, so that are potentially outside of the planning system. So I think that would be my observations, but I look forward to working with you all as we identify those sites and what's appropriate going forward.
Thank you. Joe, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I was going to say much the same, and the fact that it's not an obvious sort of correlation really, that's a real reason for sites not coming forward when we're looking at delivery. I mean, that is obviously an issue on larger sites, as we've already talked about, and agreeing those things, but generally that's one of many sort of factors. It's not an overriding factor.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Cubitt is the only one with her hand up now. Councillor Cubitt, can I ask you to be brief though this time,
yes,
if possible, please, as
time
is ticking on.
Yeah, it's just to say a piece of good news is that I was lucky to be on a forum with the Secretary of State today, and in relation to permitted development rights, affordable homes percentages equivalent to that required of sites is going to be introduced in the very, very near future. So that and the space standards will be applied. So whilst it's been an irritant and a real problem up till now, it is going to be dealt with.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. Thank you for sharing that with us, Councillor Cubitt. Right, are there any other questions or comments in relation to this housing section of the table? So anything from pages 41 through to pages half of page 46. I think we've had a very good debate already, so hopefully we've covered a lot of the ground. I can't see any more hands. Councillor Laura James. You're on mute, Councillor.
So it's page 46. It's the design of housing monitored through building and health. On that section on page 46. I mean, it's been discussed already tonight, but if you look at the quality of the permitted developments, when you remove permitted developments from that, it's still exceptionally worrying, isn't it? That in relation to the score, so that it still remains to be 238 dwellings, and in relation to the standard of those. And I just think, I mean, that's appalling, isn't it? Absolutely appalling. And I just wonder again why that is green. Shouldn't that be red, really?
Ruth or Joe, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, this one and the bottom one on page 45 are actually kind of a split of those figures. So what we've done is we've assessed the 10 sites that qualified to be assessed against the Building for Healthy Life. And what that's generally, our target in the local plan is that 50% of developments are either of a good or a very good quality in terms of against those criteria of the Healthy Life criteria. And then why we split them is that if you include the permitted development schemes, which were 2 out of those 10 schemes, 40% of those units are actually good or very good because they're so swayed by those 2 permitted development schemes. If you take those out, which is what the first one on page 46 shows you, that figure actually goes up to 61%, which is why it's green, because obviously it's more than the 50%. So the story really in terms of the design is that generally there's an improvement, and we've had the second very good score from a development this year. First one was last year. So that's a very positive sign, but it shows when you're getting high levels of permitted development, that does have an impact on your overall score.
So in relation to what I understand what you're doing, but it's still not good, is it, in a sense, I suppose. It still worries me. But what I'd then like to do is in relation to those 2 developments, in relation to permitted developments, was which really swayed it, is we're really building the slums of tomorrow, aren't we? Or today, really. And I think, I know Carolyn has said what can be done, but I think that we should look at this as a piece of work and just examine permitted developments in the committee, and for us to consider, is there anything that can be done about this? And even that, as I said it before, is should we not have ourselves bought Churchill Plaza to look at what we could have done with that site, rather than allowing that to become a permitted development? Is there opportunities that we look at some of these sites ourselves so that they don't get bought up by the private sector and create such terrible housing? But I just think that we need to have this on the agenda of our committee, really.
Thank you,
You're smiling, Councillor Ruffle. I guess I've made you laugh, I think, but
thank you, Councillor James. I share your concerns about the quality of housing in produced as a result of the permitted development rights. My understanding, Joe, I'll come back to you, is that there is nothing we can do, and we are beholden to central government rules. So whilst it would, I'm sure we will come up, anything positive will come out of that. But Joe, I'll hand back to you in case you know better than I.
No, I mean, you're right. Obviously, our hands are tied to a large degree. Just to sort of remind the committee that we did bring a couple of reports on permitted development rights probably a year or more ago now, where we did look at this in detail and all of the different aspects of those developments, what was positive and negative, and whether there was anything that we could do. So that work has kind of been done, quite a lot of it already.
Yeah, and I think there's a very good report which was published. I think it's by the University of Liverpool and the government last summer, which contains a very detailed analysis of the quality of permitted development rights. If anyone's interested there, I think let's do one more question on this area before we move on to the next section from Councillor Harvey.
Just 2 quick points, Chair. Forgive me.
Yep.
I would just say, Joe, in terms of saying the quality, it's important that we recognise that 74% last year, going down to 61% this year, that's not necessarily in the direction we want that to be in. So while accepting that 61% on face value, you could consider it to be a good figure, it is still less than last year. So I would like to understand, and we need to, obviously, in terms of future policy, we want to make sure that that's consistently high percentages and not going in the other direction. And I would just say, Chair, in terms of page 43, the amount of flats that we are seeing built as opposed to houses, and I know the permitted schemes skew it, but it is still what's being produced, as you rightly said earlier, Joe, it's what is actually being produced. We are producing an awful lot of flatted development, 2 and 3 beds, where we are going to wind up housing families as much as, and the consequences of that scale of development is something, social consequences, that we need to understand in policy going forward. And I remember when we were involved in writing the local plan, the amount of emphasis we put on houses in preference to flats because of the placemaking element that we originally wanted. And it's a shame to see the figures driving in the other direction on that. And it's something we need to do something about. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Joe, Ruth, you want to respond to that? I think it's more of a comment than a question, perhaps. So
yes, yeah, and we can pick up issues around design and density and all those sorts of policies as we work with the members going forward.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, it's gone 9 o'clock. It looks like we're in it for the long haul tonight. So can I suggest, unless anyone's got any objections, so Councillor Cubitt, very quickly, if you may.
So I want to talk about environment management and climate change section.
Okay, we'll come on to that in just a second. What I was going to propose, unless anyone's got any objections, is just to take a 5-minute break or a 4-minute break till 9:05, just so everyone can stretch their legs. We'll reconvene again at 9:05 and get cracking. And Councillor Cubitt, you will be first to ask questions about environmental management and climate change.
Chair, could I just ask for clarity? We're not going to go through this entire report tonight. Are we going to basically just use these tables to link to the main report? I don't see us going through the whole report tonight, are we?
No, I was going to. My expectation is that the vast majority of our conversation debate is going to be around these tables. I was proposing that we go section by section through the other points, but I am hoping that we can do that fairly rapidly, as a lot of the main issues will have been covered already.
Thank you, Chair.
Check I'm on. One second. I'm on.
Right, if I could ask members to switch their cameras back on, please. We'll reconvene shortly. Just waiting for a few more to come back. Lots of faces are appearing. Just waiting for a couple more people and then we'll get cracking again. Just waiting for Councillor Waldridge. If you're there, Councillor, it'd be great if you can come back and rejoin us. Wonderful, right, we have a full house again, so hopefully everyone's feeling refreshed and ready to go. So we will now look at tackling the KPIs and the RAG ratings of the environmental management and climate change section, so pages 46 through to halfway along page 49. Councillor Cubitt, you had your hand raised from before, so do you want to go first, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to say that on page 47, in reference to the comments made earlier, I would like the water quality to be in red. I understand Ruth's points and Joe's points, and they're well made, but I still believe that we're in breach of the trajectory that we're supposed to be adhering to in accordance with our local plan, and that, therefore that should be more obvious in the table. Similarly, if I could just talk about nitrate neutrality. We've alluded to the housing supply shortfall, and I think we're 589 houses short or thereabouts. And in the nitrate neutrality section, it mentions the fact that we've lost 203 dwellings as a direct result of that. Now, in the previous annual monitoring reports, Mr. Chairman, this section wasn't there, and it's not a policy. And I'm afraid I am not happy with the fact that the council has decided to gold plate a European case study that has no legal merit whatsoever on our planning authority or our planning decisions. The decision in the Netherlands does not have any impact on any legislation in the UK, and I don't understand why we are gold plating the nitrate neutrality in our annual monitoring report, and I don't understand why we are removing 203 dwellings from our annual report. And I understand furthermore that the Isle of Wight and the New Forest and Southampton, all of which are planning authorities in the same area, have not gold plated the case law that is being referred to by Natural England, and they are permitting developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Joe, do you want to explain why we've added in that point about nitrate neutrality, please?
I was just going to say quickly about the water quality line that's in there. I can understand Councillor Cubitt's view on that. The actual figures came through outside of this monitoring year. So if that's what Councillor Cubitt is thinking of in terms of the most recent EA figures, we couldn't really reflect that in this monitoring report. We just did that in the text itself so that we had an up-to-date position. So just on that. In terms of nitrate neutrality, obviously we've added it in because it's such a significant sort of local issue that we want to provide information on. The reason why we're obviously taking that into account is not because of our local issues. It's the fact that obviously we have responsibilities nationally, internationally, and development within that catchment will affect a site of international importance with the Solent, because it is a special protected area, an area of special character, etc. So it's an area that we need, because of our overall kind of international responsibility, to make sure that we're not degrading that area. and we're basically working with Natural England based on their advice, and that's why we are doing that. In terms of the figures and why we've had to take those figures out because of this issue, we cannot say that those sites in question meet the deliverability test at the moment. So although they're in the supply still, we've moved them out of the 5-year supply until we know that there's a solution to those issues. And we're working through those by working proactively with the relevant developers to make sure that they can show nutrient neutrality. And in many cases, they will be able to do that. It's going through that process. So that's why there's that position currently.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Cubitt, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I do. We have legal obligations, and you know what I'm going to say, Joe, but we have legal obligations with regards to honouring the water quality commitments in our local plan, in UK legislation, in the what are they called, the law acquis, the droit acquis that we've taken from the European Union. We have legislation that governs our water quality, and yet we don't treat it in the same way that we seem to be treating a case law in the Netherlands. So you talk about international rights, and I understand totally what you're saying, but I don't understand why we are regarding the case law in the Netherlands as more important than British law and the droit acquis that we've taken over from the European courts in terms of what we're supposed to be doing with regards to our water. And just secondly, very quickly, I wasn't aware of the nitrates until relatively recently, and I thought that the nitrates came out at the back end of last year as well. So how come they're in, but the water assessment from the Environment Agency didn't get included?
Joe.
We've tried to include for both really the most up-to-date position, even if in a way it's outside the monitoring year. So that's why we put them both, because they're seen as important and current issues, try to reflect both of them. But right, that Councillor Cubitt is right in the fact that this whole position will work its way through the courts as more information comes out. It's quite interesting that all the appeal decisions that have happened so far with relevant schemes, the inspectors, the examiners have always been on the side of caution and always gone with Natural England and refused appeals where there's not been able to approve nutrient neutrality. So that's where all the case law from a planning point of view currently is.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, Joe. Okay, Councillor Laura James.
Thank you. Mine is on habitat enhancement. And I know in the target it talks about opportunities where possible, but in the grey we've got 5 planning applications, whereas in a comparison with 18-19 there was 8. I just think that we need to do better than that, and we signed this sort of a climate change emergency. I just think that wherever possible, and there needs to be more possible. Why, I'd like to understand more, why have we only got 5, whereas historically we did 8, and can we up that more? We just need to do better against what we set ourselves.
Thank you, Councillor James. Joe, are you able to respond to that?
I mean, on this one, it's not really a case of sort of comparing numbers, really. In a way, it's taking the opportunities where they arise on the applications that come in. So where we have been able to do that, we are ensuring that there's a biodiversity sort of net gain. We can't make people do a 10% gain. We can only encourage them to do so at the minute, but we can make sure that we get a net gain. So on relevant applications that have come through, we've done that.
So in the future, if in relation to the future local plan, against this, maybe we need to look at it. If we're really committed to climate change and we really want to look at the environment and a GI strategy, we really need to think about this whole area and how we are going to have to require developers to do better. You know, we want people to do much better than this.
Thank you, Councillor James.
Absolutely, and that is something that we will look through the local plan update. And we're hoping the Environment Bill will have moved through where it needs to by that point to make sure that we've got the necessary hooks for that.
Thank you. Councillor George.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to go back, I'm afraid, to the water quality and the nitrate issues, as you probably recognise. It's something I like looking at. But
before we do that, Councillor George, I fully respect your right to do that. I was just going to wish to remind all members that Councillor Frost is looking at organising a separate session with Natural England and other stakeholders in that area. So if you think your question, or if anyone thinks any of their questions in relating to water may be better served in that meeting, then feel free to hold on to those questions till then. If you feel as though it is something that is pertinent to this evening, then you have every right, obviously, to ask that now.
Well, thank you, Chair. What I'll do is I'll make some very, very general points and a couple of questions, if I may. On the quality issue, the concerns I have very simply is the fact that I fully understand the reason for the downgrading of the rivers, and I know it's a nationwide issue, but my real concern is the fact that, you know, if you look at our policies, SS4 and what is the M6 and what have you, they do provide some protection in terms of preventing further housing development if we're going to lose. It's a whole classification. Now, the effect, what I want to check is the effect of losing a classification. We're down now I think we're moderate or medium now in the test, and poor in the sorry, what's the river? Loddon. Let's get it right. The key issue is that now, if we have developments in those areas, does it mean now that unless we can show that we're going to go from what was originally good down to poor, we get no protection? Because at the moment we've now gone to medium, and there's a whole classification you have to move down to get any protection. So number one is around the effects of that reclassification on the protection we get through our policies in the plan. That's my first question on that. The second, on the nitrates issue, is a very simple one, and that's really around a couple of unintended consequences here. What we are seeing, because fundamentally it's much easier now, if you want an offset, one of the ways things is to reduce the density of your scheme, number one, and secondly have, you know, much more open land around and everything else. We are going to be losing densities on some of these schemes, I think, through that process as they go through. And the second thing really on that is that also, given that you can lower densities, it's going to start reducing the viability or feasibility of some of these schemes and their ability to actually provide the community benefits that you get through Section 106 agreements and things like that. So I'm very concerned about some of the long-term implications of this nitrate neutrality scheme going down the line. I really am. I do note also, I think I did send a note out to one or two individuals, but Test Valley now have actually produced their own scheme, an offset scheme based upon what they are doing internally. They've actually done that, and they produced a charging structure and everything else, and they're going to use that to allow some of these developments. So the third question is, where are we on that? Is that something we are doing as a borough?
Thank you, Councillor George. Joe, do you want to have a go at those?
Yes, so just in terms of the water quality kind of policies and when it changes in terms of band status. So yes, the policy restricts, it allows us to restrict development if there's a fall in band status, which is why because it changed, as you'll know, we specifically asked the Environment Agency the reasons behind that. From that, they came out and explained, as you said, that from the chemical status point of view, it's a national issue and it's the way that it's monitored has changed, hence why it's changed band status. From an ecological point of view, there are elements in terms of certain type of fish which has gone down for reasons that are not associated with growth. So their view, if they've given us a sort of professional technical view, is that the regrading in band is not to do with development or growth, it's for other reasons. So because of that, there is no reason at this time to restrict future development as a result of it. So that's...
Can I just come back on that specific point?
Yeah, of course.
And that is, I can understand it going in that direction, but does it effectively reduces the protection, in other words, because it's been downgraded, we're going to have to go to poor before we get any protection against it. Is that correct?
No, I mean, it doesn't give us it gives us any protection in terms of kind of stopping development if it changes in band status. So it's not really overall protection. It's about how we respond to it in terms of future growth.
No, I understand that, but the fact that we now have a lower target means that if you look at our policies, SS4, it's all about if you can show that we're going to reduce a grade. If we're already at that grade, we've got to go down to the next one, haven't we, fundamentally, before any protection kicks in.
Yeah, but how the band status works is there's numerous different categories, and if just one of those changes, the whole band status falls. So what we will be looking at it is across the board. So actually certain parts of the classifications have actually improved, whereas others have fallen. So we have to look at that across the board and make sure that the issue that pulled us down, something happens with that and improves. I can see your point in terms that you're now starting sort of from a poor grade as such. Perhaps can't go any further, but it's a bit more nuanced than that because you will look at all the individual elements within that classification.
Thank you. Well, in response to the other two questions, Joe.
Yes, I can't remember what they were. I want to come back in. I mean, in terms
it was the viability of schemes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in the fact that probably the main thing that people are doing at the moment to get over this issue is looking at their densities and perhaps having more open space, taking land out of agricultural use, etc. So that will potentially have an impact on densities and viability, but that's something that we will work through with individual developers and landowners on individual schemes. So it really does depend on the scheme involved, but yes, that could be a potential outcome that you may get less units on certain schemes as a result of it.
Thank you. Does that answer all your questions, Councillor George?
There was a third question.
There was a third one.
Where we are ourselves on our own offset scheme, if it's possible. Very briefly.
I mean, at the moment, we're looking at a number of options. So from a development management point of view, we're looking at it on a site-by-site basis, working with developers to see how they can pass through their appropriate assessment and prove nutrient neutrality. So that's sort of on an individual site basis. But we are looking at it from a strategic point of view, and there's numerous things that we're looking at from that point of view. We're looking at our own land, so working across the board with our natural environment colleagues, property services and planning to see what we can do in terms of the council's own land, whether there's any opportunities there. Also working in partnership with push authorities and others to put pressure on the Environment Agency to look at the permits on the wastewater treatment works. We're looking at potential schemes such as wetland schemes in Whitchurch to see whether they can actually improve how the treatment works work. So there's numerous different options that we're looking at the moment. Also talking with Hampshire Wildlife Trust as well, who are looking at potentially acquiring land and whether there's anything we can do there in terms of trading platforms and getting credits and things. So there are a number of options, and this will develop over coming months.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor George. My watch has just bleeped to remind me that we're approaching 9:30. We've made a lot of progress, but we're still some way to go. So I'm going to propose that we suspend standing orders and continue on for another 45 minutes to around 10:15. Is everybody comfortable with doing that? If you do have an objection, please raise your physical hand. No. Looks like we're good to go. So Sadie, if you can just note that decision, please. So we'll keep going for another 45 minutes and see how far we get to. So thank you very much. Got a couple of questions left on this section, one from Councillor Miller and the second from Councillor Laura James. So Councillor Miller, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's not strictly a question. It's more to go back to the habitat question from Councillor Laura James. And I'd just like to reinforce and support what Joe Bromley said. It's very dependent on which sites have to get the regeneration or the preservation or creation of habitats. If you have a pure urban site that you're looking at, you're probably not going to have very much in the way. If you have a rural site, then it comes into play. The biodiversity officers they keep their eye on the ball here, and it comes up on planning applications on a regular basis. They mean it if they say that there's no impact or there's no requirement to create the habitats. The new Green Infrastructure Act that's going through Parliament will also include something else. They're going to be introducing nature recovery as a very big, strong it's a criteria that you're going to have to consider within planning. This is nationwide, and because I'm the borough representative on the AONB, which is a third of the borough, and it's you mentioned Whitchurch. Whitchurch is within the AONB. It's not only the rivers, but it's all the habitat and everything else. It will play a larger and larger part in our work at this level when it comes to nature and the preservation of it. The more land, the less dense the lower density of the residential applications that will be coming in will be a matter that has to be considered under that law. So I just thought I'd contribute that for you.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. That's much appreciated. Councillor Laura James.
Thank you. It's just on air quality, and I was wondering whether the committee could have back at some stage for an update, please, the air quality annual status report. It was done in 2019, and I think it would be good for us to have a look at that.
Thank you, Councillor Laura James. Is that something that's possible, Joe?
It's not something that we produce. It's actually done more by Environmental Health, but we can talk to Tom Payne about where that goes.
Thank you very much. Yes, if you can then let the chair know, that'd be hugely appreciated. Thank you, Joe. Any other questions in relation to the environmental management and climate change section? I can't see any more electronic hands, in which case we'll move on to economic development from page 49 through to 51. Obviously, the world has changed quite a lot since the time that this reflects, and we are having a separate discussion about the economic recovery framework at our next meeting on the 4th of March. But nonetheless, if anyone does have any questions on this, please do raise your hands. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. This was really interesting reading this section, the tables, and then seeing the explanation later in the main report. And I think one of the things I drew out of it, obviously, was this report is to April 2020. And I understand the Experian data, and I understand why you've written it in there in the way you have, and I respect that. I always take the Experian data with a touch of salt, simply because of where they get their information from and how they do their averages and their calculations, as opposed to what would be more localized data in that sense, I guess, in my description. My concern would be, again, looking forward, here we see a drop off in employment. No doubt that situation has been dramatically complicated by COVID. We had the economic policy come forward for consideration by the committee not too long ago. I realise that's been pushed off for a review into potentially the new council year, in where the chair's currently got it positioned. But I'm conscious that if we're going to be writing new local plan policies, the implications for our employment areas, I think, are hugely significant. And what I'm worried about is not just permitted development, as we've been talking about all evening, but in a sense, a conscious drift where office blocks, because of the very nature of the change of employment patterns, give itself over to be easily converted to residential. That's the easy option that people will run to and will fall back on, without necessarily doing a really important piece of economic analysis, which is what kind of employment land do we genuinely need for the shape of the economy as it changes and conforms, whatever normal might be as we come out the other side of this. So I'm looking at your figures here, Joe, and in terms of what the officers have done, and you've got an increase in employment floor space, but there's an analysis, I think, that needs to be done of what is the employment land we're offering. Now, the example I would give quickly is, for example, in Coronation Road, where we are seeing applications for permitted development come forward, where we are losing small-sized units that businesses are in who are being forced out of to allow a developer to convert them to residential. So we're seeing local businesses forced out of their leases, forced out of their accommodation, because a developer chooses to want to turn it into residential. And those small and medium-sized units are the very things they're after, because we've got lots of small and lots of large, but not much of in between. And in a sense, they're very special units. And I just think our analysis of this needs to be cuter, smarter. And I would hope that we could do that. It isn't, in a sense, the way we've done it historically, but I'm wondering whether or not when you take this into the maps and when you take it forward, is that something you could look at? Because I don't think the traditional way we did it last time round, just with the more broader analysis in the consultants we employed, is necessarily going to serve us in what we need to do going forward. So if that could be taken on board, I would be grateful.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, just coming back on that, you're absolutely right that the new local plan will have to be based on sort of robust, up-to-date evidence. So we have been holding off on doing our economic needs assessment until we have a little bit more certainty about what will happen. But yes, that will have to be quite a detailed study looking at all those elements and the future of our strategic employment areas in quite a lot of detail this time because of obviously numerous different trends. So yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Paul. Thank you for the response, Joe. If there's no other questions on the economic development side, I shall move us on to infrastructure. So the second half of page 51. We've obviously covered some of that already today in our first report, but does anyone have anything else they want to add there? No. Okay. Right. So that deals with the KPIs, which hopefully will cover a lot of the headline discussions that we're going to have a little bit later on. So if we move on, the next section is the introduction. So I don't propose we talk about that. Section 2 is then key contextual characteristics of Basingstoke and Deane, which is primarily facts about our borough. Councillor Watts has got his hand up there. So Councillor Watts.
Yeah, it's just a question on the statistics in 2.1.
Yeah.
Quotes that the population is going to grow by about 4,000 by 2043. I think that might be incorrect. I just wonder if officers could come back on that.
Yes. So the 2019 population is 176,600 and it grows to 180,250 by 2043. So yes, it does look like there is a typo there. I'm not sure if anyone knows what the actual figure should be.
No, we can check that figure. I think we've taken that from the small area population forecasts, but we can check that's correct.
Thank you. Yeah, if you get back to us in due course, that would be helpful. Thank you. Anything else, Gary, on that? No. Councillor Harvey?
Thanks, Chair. 211 on health. We're using the census data here, which I understand. Obviously, we've got the 2019 deprivation indices that MCHG are using. Could we use them as well as a more modern, more up-to-date reference point? Because in terms of super output areas and localised figures, I think that would be more useful to us in an appreciation of the health of our citizens, health of the residents in our borough. I appreciate the census figures, I get it, but they're so far out of date now. If we do have a modern data set to use in deprivation indices, that might be more helpful, I think.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. I suspect by the time we look at doing this again, we might have the 2021 census data, but I think that's a fair point and something for us to note in the next report. So thank you for that.
Depth, Chair. It's the depth the deprivation indices go to us, as opposed to just simply the census as well, I think. Thank you.
Right. Yes. No. Understood. Thank you. Councillor Laura Gentry, you had your hand up, but it seems to have gone down. So yeah, that's good. Okay. So let's move on to section 3, and we'll approach this section by section. We have discussed some of this already, so I propose we go through it fairly rapidly. So if we look at the local plan and the local development scheme on pages 55 and 56. Any comments on that? If we then move on to neighbourhood development plans on page 57. SPDs on page 58 and halfway through 59. Councillor Cubitt.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, which is that Hampshire County Council, who have let us down so badly, happen also to be responsible for evaluating our extant housing and also producing our delivery test action plan. And I understand that we've employed them as a service supplier for many years. And I would just like to say, and I would like it in the records, that I don't consider them to be an independent party in evaluating our plan delivery or our sites, and I don't believe that they add additional robust evaluation to our sites because they have too much skin in the game. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. That's noted. Plans, strategy and policy documents, page 58. Councillor Laura James.
Sorry, I was talking about page 60, so I'll...
Okay, well, let's hold that because we might get there fairly quickly at this rate. Climate emergency declaration. No, in which case we'll move on to page 60 and local plan update evidence. So, Councillor Laura James, over to you.
Thank you. I was just really wanting to ask that some of the reports that are underway come to committee. I think we need to have an understanding of where we are with them. For example, the retail and main town centre study, and has it taken account today, or has it taken account of KPMG's report in relation to retail, in relation to the problems that we're seeing in relation to retail, but also I'd like to come to committee, or for us to have an understanding of where we are on the leisure and recreational needs assessment, and also when does the other one that I would like to also understand is the landscape character and assessment study. So I would like to sort of have more of an understanding as a committee about these pieces of work that are going on, what the terms of reference are, and what they're looking like, and where they're going. You know, to be honest, I don't know anything about any of those. So,
no, thank you.
So that's all good stuff that we'll be able to bring to an EPH map as well, Chairman. So all of those things that are being commissioned, the policy team will be able to, bring them to the map and then to this, committee as and when things progress. So
fantastic. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the response, Ruth. Yeah, and Sadie, if I could just ask you perhaps just to make a note of that and to discuss that with the chair on his return, just to highlight those requests there from Councillor James. Okay, so if we keep moving on then to Article 4 declaration on page 61. And then we'll move on. Oh, yes, Councillor Vaux.
Thank you, Chair. This is just, again, showing my ignorance. The Article 4 direction, it says here that we were able to bring in a direction which enables us to say that some particular areas could not use permitted development rights. Now, if I've understood that correctly, weren't we earlier saying that we were concerned about permitted development rights, or have I got the wrong thing entirely? Because if I haven't misunderstood it, why haven't we just done that for everything? Sorry.
No, that's a very good question. You haven't misunderstood it at all, but I will leave it to the experts to answer exactly why the rules are what they are.
There are different permitted development rights. So this one is particularly about changing offices to residential. So what this Article 4 was that we brought in for Basingview and the Chinham strategic employment areas was to ensure that you couldn't convert offices to residential just through the permitted development. So basically they would have to go through a normal planning application route, just because they are our prime office locations. We want to ensure that use is protected. Whenever you use Article 4, you have to go through quite a detailed process showing the evidence of why you are doing that and why you're going contrary to sort of general government guidance. But we thought it was necessary for those areas, so it just relates to that particular PD right.
So a follow-up question.
Yeah, please go for it.
So could we have done that with the conversion where the quality was so appalling? That was earlier in the report. It was at Churchill Plaza or something like that. Mm-hmm. Could we have done that for that area, or is it just too difficult to blanket bomb our office areas?
Yeah, I mean, when we looked at the evidence, there wasn't a reason to do that. I mean, Churchill Plaza, for example, isn't in a strategic employment area. So we did look at different ways that we could do that across the board. And we thought the most defensible way really was just to focus it on our actual prime office areas. So that's why I think Andrew might want to come in there.
Yeah, if I could just elaborate on that. Yeah, it's obviously completely correct. It's just really and truly the Article 4 is there to protect the economic area rather than to prevent the conversions, because we don't like the conversions, if you see what I mean. That's why we're quite restricted in terms of the geographical scope for where we can do that.
Thank you, Andrew. Does that answer your question, Councillor Vox?
It does and it doesn't. Thank you, Chair. I mean, it answers the question in the sense of, it's not that I don't want them converted, it's the quality of the conversion that I'm concerned about. But thank you very much for the answers.
Thank you. I think we share your views there. Councillor Harvey and then Councillor Raffel.
Just a quick point to back up what Councillor Vox is saying, really. I think I would personally like to see a more aggressive use of this particular tool. For example, and it would have been on the Woodlands Business Park as a perfect example, where existing businesses have their businesses and have leases and are being forced out of employment areas because of the practice. So I think in terms of what we could do as an authority, I would like to see a more aggressive use of it. And it is going to be this because we're going to be challenged on it. But if we don't try, then we're letting those businesses down. So I just feel there are good examples where we could really have a go at it and try our hardest to defend more than just the crown jewels, if you like. There are more equally useful, important, I know the right words, good employment areas rather than just Basingview and Chinham Business Park. And I'd really welcome us trying to defend them.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Councillor Raffel, do you want to respond to that as well as making your point? I think you're on mute. Oh. Oh, we still can't hear you, Councillor Raffel. Still nothing. Ah, that's it. I can hear noise.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can, yes.
I don't know what's going on. I just wanted to say we took legal advice at the appropriate time, and the legal advice was that you can't indiscriminately use this power. It has to be focused, as Andrew Rushmer has said, and therefore we chose specific areas where it could easily be focused, and we felt that it was unchallengeable because those areas were business areas already and residential development suddenly sprouting up within them that hadn't already been focused or agreed was likely to be counter to what we were seeking to achieve within those areas. If therefore we focused it on the centre part of the borough, we could find we were open for legal challenge. And I have to say that makes sense because there are office buildings around, or there were. I think the officers will tell you that much of the change that came about when this new policy came about was sudden because it was releasing what were offices that weren't being developed into becoming housing stock, and that process has been gone through now. And what may or may not happen now because of COVID may mean there's another surge of this, who knows. But previously, prior to COVID, I think we were thinking it was going to tail off slightly. And if you put it over the whole of the borough, there may well be properties where businesses are in, such as older buildings at the top of the town, where you might say, well, there used to be residential accommodation before they became offices. Why can't they go back into being residential accommodation? And you might say, well, these things should be done on a case-by-case basis. And I appreciate that Article 4 doesn't allow you to do case-by-case. It either takes it out of the situation or it leaves it in and where it will happen automatically. So I'm very keen that we carry on looking at protecting areas where it's appropriate, but I'm certainly opposed to a blanket policy, and I'm not going to start initiating that. But we've looked at this as a committee in the past, and we've obviously discussed the Article 4 directions as a committee as well, and worked our way through them, and you were very supportive as a committee with me, obviously. So yeah, it's blanket policy would be disproportionate and open to legal challenge, so that's why it can't happen in that way.
Thank you, Councillor Raffel. there's no other questions on that section, we'll move on to SIL, which we have already discussed in the previous agenda item. So I'm assuming there aren't any questions, but feel free to raise your hand if you do want to make a point here. No, in that case, we'll move on to section 4, the duty to cooperate. So we're on page 63 now through to 65. Anyone want to make any points or raise any questions relating to that? No, in which case we'll move on to section 5, housing policies. So again, we have covered some of this already, but I appreciate this is probably the meat of the document. So if you do have any comments, please do chip in. So section 5.1, housing delivery. We're then looking at new homes built on page 66 and 67, 68. Page 69 takes us back to the 5-year housing land position, which I know we've already discussed. As does page 70. Councillor Cubitt.
Sorry, just to be specific, on page 67,
yes,
5.5, just for the notes for Sadie, when I was speaking earlier about the numbers, that was the figure that I said was useful to the administration or to the numbers, but actually is not truly reflective in that the 38% of dwellings, actually the bulk of that comes from neighbourhood plans. That's where the figure is that I'm not 100% happy with, whilst it might be accurate. I think a 15% of the local plan delivery should be within that as well, because that's a material percentage.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. I appreciate the point there. Yes, well, I'm sure that will help us as far as the minutes are concerned. Any other comments there? No, shake of the head. Okay, so if we move back on to page 71 now, trajectory of housing. 72 takes us on to planning consents. Then delivery of local plan allocations. Several tables there. Through to page 78. Councillor Cubitt, you've got your hand raised. Is that from before, or have you got?
Sorry, I was wondering whether we could, as a committee, request the cabinet member to send a letter to the Secretary of State outlining that we have extenuating circumstances, namely the houses that have been removed from our list, our suite, such as the nitrates of 203, namely some of the sites that are possibly going to be able to deliver earlier than we've got currently in our plan, and that we have delivered 1,600 gross dwellings this year. Could the Secretary of State be mindful, in view of the fact that we are good citizens, we have done everything we're supposed to, would he please enable us to determine that we have protection as if we had a 5-year housing supply? Because that would transform everything for us, because it would mean that we were in control. It would mean that our planning authority and our wonderful officers have got hold of the steering wheel again, as opposed to us being in the Wild West.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Does anyone else agree with that? If you just want to raise your hand, I can see a few thumbs up there. Yeah. Okay. Councillor Raffel, is that something that you can do on behalf of the committee?
I'm going to take advice from the officers. Do they think me writing to the Secretary of State to say ignore the rules and let us through the hoops without abiding by the rules is going to work? What's their advice to me, please?
Officers, does anyone want to? Ruth, I think you've been brave and switched off your microphone.
I'll take responsibility. I think that Councillor Raffel has offered earlier in this meeting that he was going to write to MHCLG, about the challenges around 5-year housing land supply. We've made note of that. We're not going to be given a different rule to the rest of the country, so that's just the honest answer. And I think we all you have to respect the fact that I have to give you the honest answer. That's not something that I would have thought would be supported, but I appreciate that we've heard the message that there's a desire for there to be some representation made.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, if we keep going on with the document, so we're on page 78 now, homes built on previously developed land. If we then move on to windfall sites on page 79, 80, 81 then talks about large site windfall consents and windfall from small sites. Again, topics we have already covered. 82 takes us on to regeneration sites. Councillor Harvey.
I was just going to say to Joe, when we were having that debate earlier about small and large, that was one of the main sponsors, Joe, on page 81, for where I took that particular point, because the figure of 50% is such a dramatic shift on that table. That's where I kind of took my point from. So I respect what you were saying earlier. That's where I took the argument from.
Thank you for clarifying, Councillor Harvey. So regeneration sites on page 82 and 83. Councillor Laura James.
Thank you. It's just in relation to the comment at the top of page 83, where it talks about outcome and key findings. Then it goes over the page onto the other side, and it talks about the council has therefore commissioned a consultant to undertake a piece of work. Well, as a councillor in Norden, the piece of work that's undertaken in relation to that doesn't reflect and didn't talk about housing opportunities. And so I think it's misleading the committee if they think that that is going to bring forward housing opportunities, because that's not where this piece of work is going. Not that we didn't want it to go there, because we did, but this isn't where that piece of work is going. So I think the terms of reference of that piece of work isn't going to give you the outcome that you want there. You should have done, and it's poor that it's not, but that's not what that's about, that piece of work. So I think that's quite misleading. If you think that you might achieve housing development from that, I don't think that's going to be the case.
Joe or Ruth, do you want to respond to that?
That's noted. I don't have any specific kind of comments on it, but yeah, that's useful information.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thanks for the question, Councillor James. Density of residential development on page 84. No. And then if we tackle all of section 5.2, location of new housing in one go, please. So from page 85 through to halfway down page 89. Okay, if we move on to section 5.3, types of housing delivered. So there's the market housing mix and type. Councillor George.
Sorry, Chair, I had my hand up for the housing and countryside section. But,
my apologies, sorry, we can definitely go back in that case.
It was really just a comment. I think as a member of DC, we're seeing basically a large, because of the 5-year land supply position we're seeing a lot of houses in the countryside getting through, particularly single houses and things like that. So I'm just worried about the trajectory on that, and the numbers we're having come through at the moment are quite significant. So it's just a comment there that it's going to be difficult to, should we say, enforce those policies, particularly SS6 and with the 5-year hand supply. So I think we can see more of that happening.
Thank you, Councillor George. Okay, so section 5.3, types of housing delivered, marketing house type mix. And then we move on to page 92, affordable housing. I know, Councillor Harvey, I know you've put your hand up, so you, Councillor James, but I think this was a point that Councillor Waldridge made right at the start and has been waiting patiently. So Councillor Waldridge, if I go over to you first on affordable housing, and then we'll follow on Councillor Harvey, Councillor Laura James after that.
Thank you very much, Chair, for remembering that. Yeah, my question, my earlier question, which is more relevant here, you're right, is of the affordable housing that was delivered, how much of that was social rented housing, which in days of COVID is much more suitable for the vast majority of our residents on the housing waiting list than affordable housing, especially affordable housing out of the town in areas such as Bramley and where which isn't necessarily appropriate for them. So I'd be interested in a breakdown on that and of how much of the affordable rented housing is social housing. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Waldridge. Joe, is that one for you?
Yeah, I mean, we can look to break it down further. Obviously, 5.70 breaks it down into intermediate and rented and shows that and how it relates to the 70-30 split. We can look to break it down further if that's what you were after.
There's a nod there from Councillor Waldridge. So if you're able to do that after the meeting, that would be wonderful. Does that answer all of your questions, Councillor Waldridge? Yep.
Yeah, but thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Just on page 94, we've got the breakdown on the table there. And I just want to pick up the point of what we're producing again in terms of housing for affordable housing. And you'll note there on the table, in terms of 2-bed units, over 130 2-bed flats have been produced in the affordable housing sector. And I want to note that our allocations policy, as it's currently written, will see those 130 flats occupied majoritively by families. In fact, there will be families in them because that's the nature of our allocations policy. So what I'm worried about and what I want to take forward is the policy implications of us driving forward affordable housing, where we are housing families in flats above ground floor in particular, which is very relevant. And I think just in terms of this graph, it exemplifies the level of stock we're seeing come forward in just this one example, this one small example of it in this year. And I wonder if we can capture that and address that issue. I think that's incredibly important for the families we're seeing struggle living in those flats because they just don't meet their needs. And once they're in them, they cannot get out of them. Once they're in those flats, they really struggle to get out of them without having very difficult needs expressed and identified and then met. So I just want to pick that up. That really exemplifies an argument we've been making for some time on this issue.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Joe, Ruth, is there anything we can do to try and address that issue?
I think that's just for us to note, actually, and speak to the housing officers about it in terms of the allocations policy.
Thank you. Councillor Laura James.
I think the housing are saying they're not keen to change this, but if they're not going to change their policy, maybe its planning has to look at that we're not building 2-bedroom affordable or as many 2-bedroom affordable units, because if you look there at the number of houses that we're building in 2 bedrooms, it almost equates to this same amount. So if you're on the register and you're only allowed to apply for a 2-bedroom unit, if obviously it's going to take longer for a 2-bedroom house to come along, so you will accept a 2-bedroom flat, not really knowing that you can't. Once you're in that house, you're taken off with the register. So it's really, if housing aren't going to change their policy, then maybe we need to be looking at what we're building around 2-bedroom units, and we need to be building more 2-bedroom houses. And I also wanted to pick up on the point, the next point down, 5.70, is around the 70-30 split. And in relation to Kenall Farm, I mean, there are some concerns in the report that it's not been met, but it says that it will be met, but it's in phasing. My concern is, in relation to that, are we then lumping all of the affordable housing into one area? Or why, in terms of phasing, has it been left to the last part of the development, the 33 units in Kenall Farm to be built? Why was that not built earlier on, or why is it not being pepper potted through the development? Because that is obviously skewing our figures at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor James. On your first point around the 2-bedroom flats. What I would suggest perhaps is let's see what response the housing team come back with when that is reported back to the committee. If we feel that is an unsatisfactory answer, then we can potentially look at what we can do on the planning side of things. So if that could be noted, Sadie, I'd appreciate that. In terms of Kennel Farm, I'm not sure, Joe, if you know enough about that to be able to comment on why the phasing is as it is.
No, I don't know the specifics of that scheme. I'm sure there are reasons why, but I couldn't tell you what they are at the moment.
Do you know who would have the answer for that?
Development management colleagues, probably in terms of case officers and housing, but we can have a look at that.
Cool. Yeah, if that question could be passed on to them and a response given to Councillor James, that would be helpful. Councillor Cubitt.
Thank you very much. I have a feeling with regards to Kennel Farm, because when I read through all the data, it's to do with a grant, and it was to do with viability. And at the 11th hour, they got a grant, if my memory serves me right, but it might be a different site. But that's why there's 7. Anyway, actually, what I wanted to talk about and what I'd love to hear from Ruth is in relation to 5.71. And in 5.71, it states that the NPPF introduced national thresholds for the delivery of affordable housing, which superseded the thresholds set out in local plan policy CN1. As a result, we now implement the NPPF's new threshold. And the question I want to ask of Ruth is, Ruth, we've been consistently told for the last umpteen years that when there was legislation that changed through the House of Commons, we couldn't refer to the updated legislation, and we couldn't therefore supersede improved legislation upon the requirements of developers as a result of the fact that our local plan was approved and it didn't refer to new legislation. And this seems to kind of contradict that position, and I just wondered why we've allowed the NPPF to supersede our thresholds in policy CN1, but we were not, and this is before you were here, but we were not allowed to apply the new space standards and quality standards that were introduced in the House of Commons on developers, because we were told that we didn't make reference to that legislation in our local plan. Thank you.
Ruth.
Okay, so I think your question covers 2 areas. So I think you effectively asked me a question about affordable housing, which is you've brought in here, but now you've actually really asked me a question about the adoption of the space standards. So I think that you've confused me with your question, maybe on purpose, I'm not really sure. But there is the reality that a lot of authorities had to then progress to develop a policy to adopt the national space standards, and that actually is what happened across the piece. So I'm not going to, I suppose, enter into what you've been previously advised. It's a bit awkward for me to be put on the spot in this way. Happy to clarify that with Joe, and then we can provide a written answer clarifying that, because we've got a few questions tonight that we are going to be providing written answers on.
Are you happy with that, Councillor Cubitt? Oh, sorry, Joe, you were going to say something.
I was just going to come back in terms of the sort of space standards. I mean, as Councillor Cubitt will know, we obviously asked government and asked if that could be done, and didn't have to be done through the local plan, and the advice from them was that it did have to go through a local plan process because of the viability considerations. So that was why we couldn't do it. In terms of the affordability thresholds, that changed, and so through the NPPF, so it came in through a different means as such, and could be applied straight away to policy, and was expected to be applied by policy by government.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Cubitt, are you happy with that response, and the fact that further clarification will be provided?
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Good, thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Forgive me, let me, in a generic sense, just let me get this straight in my head. So when government chooses to, it can change our local plan to its heart's content. When we want to, our hands are tied behind our back. Is that effectively what you're saying? Because there's 2 different standards being applied here. The NPPF is being used as a vehicle and being used by the government to change policy. And when we want to actively change our policy, we are prevented from doing so. So it's one rule for them and another rule for us. You know, localism against getting a kick in the teeth, isn't it? If I understand it right.
It depends on the route they use. Exactly, if they update the MPPF, then that's a material consideration immediately for us to take into consideration. They were quite clear with the space standards because it had viability consideration. You had to go through a full process and couldn't therefore be imposed.
Sorry, John, I'm being really ignorant here, but the affordable housing thing will have viability considerations as well.
Potentially, yes, absolutely, but potentially from a more helpful way than the less helpful way in terms of developer, if you see what I mean, rather than having this a standard imposed upon them that could have a viability issue. The affordable housing was more to facilitate development. That was sort of the reason behind it.
I think this is a double standard, isn't it, where we're being left hanging in this regard, and I find it very frustrating because there are really important policies we want that we obviously are being prevented from having, and yet it's perfectly all right for another vehicle to be used in that way.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. for what it's worth, I agree, yes. Okay, if we keep cracking on, so if we move on to page 95 now, housing for older people and people with support needs. That takes us through 95 and 96. Councillor Laura James.
I think, you know, Carolyn raised this, and I was wanting to raise it as well, that clearly we haven't managed to achieve this here. And I think what we need to do is in the working groups is to explore how we can change this. And it didn't work. And it's obviously, we've got an aging population, and it is going to be a significant issue for us going forward, and particularly in relation to also people with support needs. And I think that we've really got to think about this and maybe explore how we might do this differently. So I'm not sure, looking at the agendas, is this being picked up in one of those groups? If not, can we do that, please?
Yeah, Ruth, is this going to be covered in any of the forthcoming MAP sessions?
We need to map out the future subject matters with the chairman and work with the members for the second half of this year around different topics, and we'll be working with the portfolio holder around that. So, but there'll be an order as to what we do. So we'll have to come back to you on that. Sorry, I
meant in relation to the local plan. Really, that's what I was referring to.
Yes, that's what. Yeah, that is what the maps work on. So we'll basically be putting together a program of potential topic areas to be covered, and we'll look at those. Thank you, Ruth. So and thank you for the question, Councillor James. We'll make sure that that's added to the list of requests. Right, if we move on to self-build and custom house building, which I think is the subject of its own map, if I remember rightly. So that's from page 97 through to the bottom of page 102. Anyone have any comments there? If not, we will then move on to gypsy and traveller accommodation from the bottom of page 102 through to the bottom of page 105. No, and then sorry, Councillor Cubitt, yes.
Sorry, just very quickly, I would like it on record that the reason why we're failing on all of these.
Sorry, could you just speak up a little bit? We just can't quite hear you there.
Sorry, the reason why we're failing on these two red stages is specifically because of the public sector owned land that we failed to deliver in our allocated sites. And I feel very strongly about that, both in terms of the gypsy and traveller and in terms of the other category, these self-builds. If we'd been according to our plan, Joe and her wonderful plan, and Ruth and our officers' plan, we'd be meeting all of these things.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Yes, as you say, that point has been made earlier, and it's I think it's a valid one to make again. So thank you for that. That has been noted. Okay, if we move on to section 5.4, housing delivery through neighbourhood planning, that starts on page 105 and goes all the way through to the bottom of page 114. Councillor George.
Thank you, Chair. Just, as we've discussed previously, I think the neighbourhood plan has contributed significantly to the development or delivery of housing in the borough. Could I have reassurances that go forward with the review of the local plan that basically those areas with neighbourhood plans in place will given the full opportunity to decide where the housing developments are going to go forward in the future, and that we're not going to get housing developments allocated through the local plan on those areas with neighbourhood planning?
Thank you, Councillor George. Is that one for you, Joe or Ruth, or is that one for Councillor Raphael?
Just from my point of view, I mean, we already have started those conversations with parish and town councils, who will obviously be involved in that process every step of the way. We haven't decided what the spatial strategy obviously will be as yet, so we will obviously have those conversations as we get through the process.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Raphael, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Chairman, I don't want to add anything to it apart from say good night to you all. I'm going to say thank you to Robin and Andrew, Robin Kelly and Andrew Rushmer, for all their hard working assisting Joe and the team in putting this report together. We're past the 45 minutes that you gave us earlier. I've been, and I don't expect violence because I'm sure many of you have been in the situation, some of you have been travelling, I'm sure, being on a computer or online to do with work and council stuff for 16 hours now today, and I'm shutting down. If you wish to contribute further, I'd advise you to email the officers and share it with the rest of us, because whilst we're all, some of you are making useful contributions, the ability of my ability to absorb such information at this hour is impossible, and it may well be others of you are in a similar boat. So can I just say thank you? I have appreciated it. Well, I wasn't barring a little bit of ping pong earlier with one particular person. I think it's been very helpful going forwards, and I appreciate the constructive approach that you've all adopted to understanding that it isn't a question of trying to blame people for how we've got to a situation. It's about trying to make sure we don't repeat it in the future, and I look forward to other suggestions from you all in due course about how to do that. Look forward to seeing it, the maps, they're coming very soon, and at the wish of prolonging the meeting any further, I'm just going to say thank you, Chairman, for chairing this tonight and stepping into the breach, and good night.
Thank you very much, Councillor Raphael. Yes, you're spot on. I was about to point out after we finish this section, because we've got to the end of section 5.4, that it is now 10:15. It's obviously quite a dense document, and it's been a long evening, so I was going to propose that we do call it a day. I appreciate this is the second meeting we've had in consecutive weeks, and we have a number of MAP meetings planned as well over the coming few weeks. So having to find another slot to conclude this session is not ideal, but I think continuing on where everyone is starting to flag is certainly the worst option. So I propose that we call it a day now, and we ask officers to see if they can find a slot at some point for us to conclude this meeting from section 5.5 onwards. If anyone's got any objections to doing that, I'm very welcome to listen to those. Any hand, if you want to raise your hand electronically or virtually, if you do have a comment to make. Councillor Cubitt.
Hi. Whilst I hear what Councillor Raphael said,
can you just move your microphone a little bit closer?
Sorry. Whilst I hear what Councillor Raphael says, and I totally understand, I actually don't think you've got an awful lot more to cover, because most of it's already been covered through the rags. And I think you might actually find it'll be done, and then we don't have to have it. I don't know what other people think. I'm
just conscious that Councillor Raphael has left. Councillor Miller has just left as well.
Okay.
Councillor James, I think he's just raised his hand. So, Councillor James, do you want anything to add to that?
I actually think, and it's quite painful to say this, I think Councillor Raphael might have been right. That actually whether there's lots left or not, it's hard to tell, but actually this is a document that's already been published. Is there any other comments? They could just simply be emailed to the officer. I'd hate to see the officers have to spend another night waiting to the end of a committee meeting to come in and see us for potentially whether it's 4 minutes left or 45 minutes left, we don't know. So emails to the officers for any leftover remarks or comments we want to make probably is the safest way of doing it, and then they can go home. We're actually already at home, but we can go back to our home lives, if you know what I mean.
I'm seeing a few nods there as we do that. Does anyone have an objection to us doing that? I certainly don't. Councillor Laura James.
I think it'd be good if people do email officers that everyone's included in that. So because obviously they're points that we wouldn't have heard otherwise. So rather than people emailing them individually, I think if we're all included in that, so we have a flavour of what else is being discussed. Because I did have a few other comments, so I will happily share those with the rest of the committee. But I think we need to do it as a collective, otherwise we're not going to have an understanding of.
May I suggest, just to avoid email overload, because if all of us start emailing, it could end up taking quite a while, that perhaps we all email still individually, but the report or any questions are all compiled into a single document, and then everyone gets them, so we can all see the answers of what questions have been asked. Looking at my own inbox and how messy that is, to have lots more questions coming through would may not be ideal. If everyone's comfortable with that, then we should do that. But I agree that the answers should be circulated widely so everyone can see that. Are you happy with that, Councillor Laura James?
Well, the only thing about that is in relation to minuting what comes from this committee, we'll have an answer, but will we have the questions that we've asked, and how will they be recorded as part of this meeting?
Well, I propose that we then do the document, that the response that's sent round is done as a Q&A, so it has the question and potentially the person who's asked the question, and then it has the response and the name of the officer who's responded. Is that acceptable to everyone? Good. Okay. Well, in that case, let's call it a day. Thank you very much for your attention over the past almost 4 hours. We've got through a huge amount. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for being kind to me for my first ever session as a chair, and I look forward to seeing you at some of the maps over the coming weeks.